Chapter 1332. Although the gods had left this world for thousands of years, there was no doubt that their majesty and will still existed in this world. Now, the last bit of authority they had left in this world had also collapsed. There was only one possibility, and that was that the gods had completely given up on Wand. The believers of the dead moon waited anxiously in the hall. What happened in front of them was enough to completely topple their beliefs. However, the Supreme One with the Mercury staff did not say anything. The bloody reality reminded them that the best choice at the moment was not to choose. The dozen or so cold corpses reminded them of this point. Soon, a few liches came out from the darkness behind. They came to the corpses and placed their hands on the heads of the corpses. The corpses stood up shakily and followed the liches out of the hall like puppets. Brando saw this scene and of course knew that it was the undead transformation spell. Most of the believers in this hall were the children of the dark nobles in the holy city. The Queen of Madara dared to kill them, but she had to give an explanation to the families behind them. This was actually a political miracle in Madara. As human dark nobles, especially the saints, they had a natural immunity. No matter what purpose they were executed for, they had a chance to be transformed into undead and serve the empire again, except for blasphemers. However, this was not a good choice for these human dark nobles, because most of them joined the holy temple from a young age to learn how to serve the gods. Most of them were almost isolated from their families. Even if they returned to their families as undead, they would not have any chance to stand out in this life. They might even be chased out to lead the army to fight against the elves and humans. In fact, it was almost the same as being cannon fodder. "Your Majesty," Brando said. The Queen of Madara turned around and shook her head at him. There were still some aftershocks in the temple. The 17 white bone pillars were still shaking, but it was not as obvious as before. In the aftershocks, only Her Majesty the Queen and the Lord Officiant beside her were able to keep their expressions unchanged. Delphian went to Brando's side with a pale face. She was obviously not informed in advance. The scene just now had frightened her. A piece of stone flew past her left shoulder. If it had been a little higher, this daughter of the Prime Minister would have died. Although she was now a summoned creature of a planeswalker and could be resurrected even if she died, for this young lady, she was obviously not familiar enough with this identity. What happened? Brando noticed Delphian coming to his side and immediately asked in a low voice. But the latter shook her head. She used her hand to brush away the wet hair on her forehead and answered with a trembling voice, "I don't know. Because the negotiations have already come to an end, Her Majesty the Queen will only meet you. Now that I think about it, she deliberately delayed the end of the negotiations until today. She and Archbishop Philip must have planned this." The two were almost whispering. Brando used his own law to seal the space, and he did not care if Her Majesty the Queen and Philip, who were a few steps away, noticed anything. "Why?" he asked. "I don't know." Delphian bit her lower lip and shook her head. "It's too sudden. But don't worry, I don't think Her Majesty the Queen is targeting us." Brando actually thought the same. He felt that the woman in front of him did not need to go through so much trouble to deal with him. He looked up and saw Her Majesty the Queen pick up the Mercury staff. But she did not speak. The one who spoke was Philip, who was beside her. The Archbishop, who had always been a wooden figure, took a step forward and stood in front of Her Majesty the Queen. He looked up and said sternly, "Be quiet. Return to your seats and continue chanting. You must remain pious. No matter what you see or hear, you must not doubt the faith in your heart. Your Lord your God is calling for you. Go back, return to your seats, and pay your respects to eternal death and rest." His tone was not loud, but there seemed to be some kind of magic in his words. The believers looked at each other, but the bloodstains on the ground were enough to remind them what they should do. Soon, the hall reverberated with the low and oppressive chanting of prayers. Philip turned his head and looked gloomily at the remnant of the icon. Brando found the opportunity to speak again. "Your Majesty, you have to give me an explanation." "I will." Her Majesty looked at him and replied coldly, "But not now. I don't have that much time to explain everything to you. You have to answer a question of mine." "If it's the previous question," Brando replied, "then I have already answered you." Her Majesty the Queen's cold gaze swept over him. "I hope you will fulfill your promise. But responsibility is responsibility. You will understand this. Could Odin use a simple excuse to deny everything he has shouldered? But in the history we know, he and the four wise ones did not choose to act as cowards. Naturally, I won't either." "I hope so." She lifted her chin. The hall of the Temple of the Dying Moon had already cracked open. A beam of silver-white moonlight descended from the vault and shone on the altar, making Her Majesty's face appear snow-white. Philip, take them to the sanctuary of the Silent Death. Soaps, Netta, protect the Archbishop. Wait, what does this mean? Brando froze for a moment. This woman was the one who summoned them, but after asking him a few strange questions, she wanted them to leave. He did not care what the Queen was up to, but he was not someone who would be easily manipulated. He immediately had Andrea stop the undead lords who were walking up to the stage. He frowned and looked at the Queen on the stage. I said, I will explain everything to you, but not now. Queen Madara also frowned. Madara has already satisfied all your requests. I need your attitude now. Can't you even do this? What do you mean? The hall shook again. Behind Klyce's holy statue, the dark wall creaked. Some bricks protruded out of the wall and fell to the ground. Brando watched as a crack of a few meters appeared on the wall. It was as if something was behind the wall, ready to break out. Madara turned back to look at him, and then turned around with a calm expression. Are you really going to discuss this with me here? But... Brando hesitated. Let's go. I don't have time to talk nonsense with you. You are not a child, Count, Queen Madara replied coldly. When I gave you the Mercury staff, did I say so much nonsense? Brendel froze for a moment and suddenly realized that it seemed to be true. Although he had always regarded Her Majesty as a great enemy, she really didn't seem to have done anything against him other than giving such an order on the battlefield. But the final result was still beyond his expectations. He looked at the Queen and nodded silently. I hope your explanation is satisfactory. After he finished speaking, he looked around and took in everything in the dilapidated hall. At this moment, he had a premonition that perhaps the scene that was playing out here today was not limited to the holy city of the undead. But it did not matter. He could wait for the Queen's explanation. With that, he turned around and left the hall with Andrea and Delphian. The lords of the undead wanted to stop them, but before they could get close, they were pushed away by an invisible force and crashed into the crowd of believers, causing a commotion. The expressionless Philip glanced at the Queen of Madara, but the latter ignored him and nodded her head silently. The officiator immediately followed after them. The hall was still trembling from the tremors, and from time to time, sand and stones would fall from the dome of the holy cathedral. The believers trembled in fear, looking at Brendel and the other two walking in the middle of the hall with fear and envy, wishing that they were the ones who left at that moment. The sanctuary of the Silent Death was located in the core area of the holy sanctum of the Dying Moon. A place like this was often a sacred place for meditation in a holy sanctum. Delphian happened to be there recently, and she gestured to Brando as she walked, telling him that there might be some situation there. There was a long corridor outside the holy sanctum. Brando looked back and saw that Philip had not caught up. He waved his hand at the latter, indicating that she did not need to be so careful. What's going on? When I was there a few days ago, I saw the undead building something there, my lord. What is it? I only saw it from afar, but I thought that since the undead could let me go there, it shouldn't be anything important. I only thought that they were repairing the interior of the holy sanctum. Brando frowned, but his thoughts were similar to Delphian's. Since Her Majesty was not afraid of Delphian seeing it, there should not be anything too fishy about the sanctuary of the Silent Death. However, this matter piqued his curiosity. Since Queen Madara had already made arrangements there, she must have been preparing for today's matter. The sanctuary of the Silent Death was to the north of the holy sanctum of the Dying Moon sanctum. After passing through the long corridor, one could see the main entrance of the sanctuary. However, the moment Brando stepped into the sanctuary of the Silent Death, he seemed to have sensed something and heard a shrill scream from the void. He froze and turned around, but Archbishop Philip's deadpan face suddenly appeared in front of him. Lord Officiator, did something happen? They're back, Count Philip. To Brendel's surprise, the Lord Archbishop actually responded to his question and slowly opened his mouth to answer. The gods. Chapter 1333. Master. A clear and surprised cry came from behind. Brendel turned around in surprise and saw Huang Hua, with her black hair draped over her shoulders, walking out of the place of death. She wore a red swordswoman's uniform with a golden phoenix on it. She held a sword in her hand, followed by Mr. Liu and Fang Qi. Huang Hua, why are you here? Brando was stunned and asked. Miss Delphian asked us to come here. Huang Hua glanced at the Prime Minister's daughter standing beside Brando and answered. It's Her Majesty's order. Delphian lowered her head and explained softly. Aren't you afraid that she'll kill us all? Brando said angrily. The Prime Minister's daughter did not speak. She looked at Brando calmly. Brando understood what this woman meant from her eyes. She deliberately tied Huanghua, the princess of the 9 phoenixes, to her own chariot so that Queen Madara would not act rashly. What an unnecessary move. Delphian did not refute, but Huanghua defended her. It's not Miss Delphian's fault. Master, it's Huanghua's idea. Brando shook his head. Although his student was smart, she was still too naive in front of Delphian, a scheming woman. She was betrayed and still wanted to count the money for others. However, Delphian was his subordinate, and he did not want to expose her in front of her. He just turned his head and glared at her. Lord Officiant, what does Her Majesty mean? He turned his head and asked. Before he finished speaking, the ground suddenly shook violently again. With a few cracking sounds, a few holes a few inches wide extended from one side of the wall. Brando's words were stuck in his throat. He turned his head and saw that the wall of the hall had begun to tilt. Andrea, who was in that direction, also looked up and saw this scene. Without another word, Brendel picked up the Prime Minister's daughter and grabbed Huanghua's hand with his other hand. He called out in a low voice, "What are you waiting for? Run." With that, he dragged Phoenix Hua and charged into the Sanctuary of Solitary Death. Someone was faster than him, and that was Andrea. She spread her wings of light and overtook everyone in an instant. After a few steps, they would reach the gate of the Sanctuary of Solitary Death. Inside the gate was an open patio about 300 feet wide. On the green meadow there were plants like laurel, black roses, and heather. Brando landed on the meadow and threw Delphian and Phoenix Hua onto the meadow. He then used the threads of law to stabilize the two. Behind him, the long corridor to the south of the Sanctum of Silence collapsed with a few crisp cracking sounds. Dust rose high into the air, and after a series of coughs, Fang Qi and Sir Lu emerged from within, their faces covered in dust. Brendel looked past the two of them, knowing that the collapse of a building would not be able to hurt an elemental awakened powerhouse. But he soon saw the spotless Archbishop Philip slowly walking out of the smoke and dust with a calm expression. Seeing that the three of them were fine, Brando had time to remove the threads of law and let Phoenix Hua and Delphian slowly land on the ground. The Princess of the Kingdom of 9 Phoenix bowed respectfully to him. "Thank you for saving us, teacher." Brando waved his hand carelessly. He did it purely because Phoenix Hua was still young. But in fact, even if he did not do anything, the former might not have been injured. Teacher's kindness is as heavy as a mountain. Phoenix Hua is not being overly courteous, Phoenix Hua replied seriously. Brando could only accept her bow helplessly. His student and Haru's seemed to be two extremes. One was timid and difficult to make his own decisions, while the other was scrupulous and abided by the rules, like a little adult. He looked up and observed the environment of the sanctuary. In fact, Andrea, who had entered the sanctuary first, had already been looking around. Like most religious buildings in Wonde, the sanctuary of the Dying Moon Sanctum was built in a small garden. This kind of courtyard in a majestic building was popular in the year of the return of the light. Its luxurious and serious style quickly became the standard of religious buildings. The monks of Wonde believed that being close to nature was conducive to harmony of mind and body. It was the best environment for meditation and quiet prayer. The believers of the Dying Moon followed suit and built such a sanctuary in the Dying Moon Sanctum. However, the style of the undead was very different from the style of humans and elves. A good courtyard garden was turned into a gloomy cemetery by the undead. Black and white roses were scattered on the dark green meadow, and there were also thorns as thick as an arm. There were also a few tombstones. Those who were buried in this place must have been saints of a certain era. By the way, if the saints were not expelled from the Dying Moon Sanctum, they would not be resurrected as undead. This was a blasphemy to the goddess, and it was a tradition of the Dying Moon Sanctum. At the other end of the courtyard, there was a pale Baroque garden pavilion covered with gloomy vines. Brando glanced over there and did not see what Delphian said the undead were building. He turned to Archbishop Philip and asked, "Lord Officiator, what exactly is going on?" But before Archbishop Philip could answer his question, Andrea suddenly shouted, "Let's see who's in charge. Be careful." A solemn expression suddenly appeared on Archbishop Philip's usually wooden face. The man turned his head and looked at the ruins that were filled with smoke and dust. The others also looked in that direction. Brando's senses were the strongest, and he was the first to see a few long shadows extending out of the smoke and dust. It happened to be the southern wall of the Silent Death Sanctum, which no longer existed. But on the east and west sides of it, there was a small sanctum that had collapsed. A hideous opening extended out of the ruins, as though a knife had cut the grass and opened a bifurcated gap in the courtyard garden's meadow. At this moment, the strange shadows extended out from the crack. They were like black blood flowing on the meadow, but all of a sudden, they seemed to be pulled up from the ground by an invisible force. They stood up in a strange posture like chewing gum, and they were even laughing shrilly at the same time. The mouths of these shadows were also very strange. It was like a crack without any thickness, but the insides were blood red. They had 4 eyes and the insides were burning with raging flames. They laughed shrilly as they surrounded the silent death sanctum. Brando saw this and could not help but curse inwardly. Spawn of the evil god. He suddenly thought of Philip's words and his heart skipped a beat. The spawn of the evil god in Wone did not refer to a specific type of monster. In fact, it was a general term for a group of monsters. They could be the descendants and heirs of the evil god, or they could be the hatchlings of abominations, or the evil thoughts that escaped from the nightmares of the gods. They had all kinds of strange appearances, so it was impossible to judge them from their appearance. But they all had one thing in common: they had incomplete dark divinity. Most people who knew a little about religion would be able to recognize these disgusting things at a glance. But it was useless to recognize them because most people could only wait for death when faced with divine creatures. Moreover, these shadows were not the descendants of those trash evil gods, demigods, lesser gods, or divine servants. Brando could already smell the dense power of law and order on their twisted bodies. In his previous life, he had only seen similar things a few times in the dreams and evil thoughts of the true gods. However, that was the evil thoughts of the gods. It was something that could not be avoided by any god. It did exist, but it was usually not a big threat. This was because once the gods discovered that their evil thoughts were born, they would kill them. When players discovered the nightmares or evil thoughts of the gods, they would often receive rewards and benefits from the gods. But he was sure that these things in front of him were the descendants of the true gods, the twisted descendants of the true gods. How did they come about? Brando already had an answer in his heart. He looked at Philip with a heavy expression and asked, "Lord Archbishop, you said that the gods had returned. Did you mean the goddess of the dead moon or everyone?" Archbishop Philip turned around and looked at him, but his wooden face seemed to be wearing a human skin mask. His cheeks twitched, but he did not speak. "The goddess of the dead moon has fallen? You already knew?" "She was only reawakened by someone, Count Philip." Archbishop Philip replied with an indifferent expression. As he spoke, he pulled out a scepter from under his robe. "Reawakened? Reawakened, that is the spirit of the gods, the spirit of the gods." Andrea muttered softly. She seemed to be very scared, her face was a little pale, and she kept repeating this sentence. "The spirit of the gods?" Brando had never seen the goddess of war show such an expression before, so he asked. "My lord, the goddess of the dead moon had already passed away in the previous era. There is only one possibility for her to be reawakened. That is what the Black Prophecy said: the wolf walks in front and the calamity follows. This is the calamity of the gods. The deceased gods are like spirits that have been reawakened. They once created this world, but now they want to destroy it with their own hands. That is only a legend, Miss Andrea." Brando shook his head in disbelief. Although Babasha and the others believed in the Black Prophecy, he had always ignored this prophecy. After all, a prophecy was a prophecy. Half of his soul came from another world, so he had a strong resistance to things like the future and prophecies. However, Andrea shook her head vigorously and said with certainty, "My lord, there is such a possibility. There is such a possibility. If that legend is true." Chapter 1334. The gods won't really die. They just lose their power and sleep in the deep space. Legend has it that the Twilight Dragon planted a seed in the world of order in the previous era. The gods beat him at his own game and wanted to use that cage to seal him. That seed should have been destroyed, but it is said that he didn't die. He has been sleeping in this world. If the Twilight Dragon finds him? If the Twilight Dragon finds him, what will happen? Brando's heart skipped a beat. This sentence caught his attention and he asked subconsciously. The Twilight Dragon will discover the true secret of our world. At that moment, death and despair will dominate everything. We will have no way to escape. Everything, including the fate of Martha and the divine people, will be covered by its spread wings. The secret of our world? Brando frowned. "Why is it this again?" he asked. "The secret of our world, what is it?" I don't know, my lord. That is just a legend, but that legend is true. You see, it has been realized." Brando suddenly realized that the girl's situation was a little strange. He glanced back and found that Andrea's eyes were pitch black, as if her pupils and the whites of her eyes had been swallowed by something. He was shocked and quickly turned around to grab her shoulders and shook her hard. "Wake up." Andrea was suddenly stunned. The darkness in her eyes quickly faded away. She looked at Brando in a daze. Suddenly her legs went soft and she knelt down subconsciously. Brando hurriedly supported her and shouted, "What's wrong, Miss Andrea?" "I'm fine." Andrea's face was pale. She finally came back to her senses. She grabbed Brando's strong arm and steadied herself. "I'm sorry, my lord. My mind has been taken away by the darkness." "Don't lose hope. Things are far from that stage." "I understand." Only then did Brando let go of her hand. He turned around and slowly made a motion of drawing a sword. A beam of golden flames flowed from his palm and formed a long sword covered in cracks. Holy Sword Odorfice, the most resistant holy sword among the 7 holy swords. At the same time, the path of golden flames had the meaning of purification and purity. It was most suitable to deal with the evil and distortion in the divine nightmare. However, the evil god's son was of the same origin as it, so it was naturally restrained by the holy sword. The other holy sword that was more suitable to deal with the evil god's son was the holy sword of light, Mysore. The reason was self-evident, but Brando did not have the latter at the moment. From the conversation between the 3 of them to Brando drawing the sword, only an instant had passed. Those distorted monsters had already walked close, and the screams in their mouths suddenly turned into terrifying screams. They then pounced over with bared fangs and claws. Before the claws of those shadows reached him, Brando could already feel a withering aura. That was the law and order that the goddess of the dead moon, Cleis, was in charge of. Unlike the kingdom of the dead that Hela was in charge of, Cleis protected the dead. She was the goddess of the undead, walking on the earth with suffering and despair, not the death of all things. Therefore, instead of saying that she was the goddess of the dead, it was better to say that she was the master of the gate to the kingdom of eternity. However, her eternity was not really a stagnation of time but an eternal rest. However, the law aura of Cleis on the evil god's son was even more chaotic and desperate. It was as if after devouring all things, the world was only left with an empty eternity. Such power swept across Brando's law line, and he could not help but shiver. At that moment he seemed to have seen the world after the end with his own eyes. After Wone died, all things fell silent, and only a grey dust was left between heaven and earth. There was neither space nor time. The corpses of the gods floated in this sea of ashes, and all life was completely silent. Only grey snowflakes fell from the sky, and purple lightning flashed above the clouds. However, that was the violent magic power of the Sea of Chaos. Brando's heart throbbed. He suddenly understood how the Silver Queen felt back then. Instead of living in such a world, it was better to let this world go crazy at the last moment. If one did not explode in silence, one would perish in silence. However, at the last moment he came to his senses. Fortunately, it was not the goddess of the dead moon, Cleis, who was affecting him, but her weak descendant. Brando broke out in a cold sweat and shouted, "Get out of my way!" The illusion in front of him disappeared, and only the evil god's son was left, waving its claws at him. In fact, this thing was not very strong. Its strength was only at the peak of the elemental enlightenment. However, Brando could see that these distorted things had not reached the point of full maturity. They seemed to have just escaped from a crack in the void and were not familiar with this world with poor magic power. Once they grew up, the consequences would be unimaginable. These things could not be mentioned in the same breath as the trash of Rushta. Without thinking, he thrust his sword forward and pierced the shadow's heart. The monster was like a real person. It held its heart with both hands and let out a shrill scream. Its body fell backward, and when it fell to the ground, it seemed to turn into a thin sheet of paper. In an instant, the ice and snow melted away. Brando saw this strange scene and could not help but feel a chill. The evil god's son was terrifying because they were born from the distorted laws of this world. Therefore, they were completely different from the creatures of the Woned world. In other words, in the Amber Sword, they were born with the bad taste of the art designers. They were as disgusting as they could be. Thinking of this, the curses in his heart for those damned art designers took over, and he no longer felt so uncomfortable. Looking back, Archbishop Philip had already killed one of his opponents. The third to end the battle was Andrea. Although her previous performance was a bit abnormal, she was still a young girl from a fighting race, so dealing with the Dusk race was a piece of cake. Only Fang Chi and Mr. Liu encountered a little trouble. Brando helped them deal with their opponents one by one, leaving only Phoenix Fire. Mr. Liu saw this and wanted to help, but Brando stopped him and shook his head at him. Mr. Liu understood. He looked at the princess of the Jade Phoenix race with some worry, but in the end he did not help. Brando was not very worried. The descendants of Cleis and Phoenix Fire were similar in strength, but the nature of their power was very special. It was difficult for ordinary people to deal with them. Such opponents were not easy to find, and they were suitable for Phoenix Fire. Especially when these monsters were not mature yet, their threat was correspondingly reduced. After a while, Phoenix Fire would be no match for them. Soon, only the son of Diablo was left in the courtyard. Brando asked everyone to step back and leave enough space for Phoenix Fire to fight. Then he turned around holding the holy sword and asked Archbishop Philip, who was beside him, word by word, "What's going on? What is going on right now? Lord Officiator, is the evil god about to descend upon this city?" Unlike before, Brando's voice now contained unspeakable anger. If there was no reasonable explanation, he would not mind killing the Archbishop of the Waning Moon Temple before dealing with Clyce. He knew very well that if the goddess of the waning moon descended in this city, everyone here would be doomed. He might be fine, but Medisha, Hippamera, and Lady White Fog would not be spared, let alone Phoenix Fire and Mr. Liu. Thinking of this, he could not help but deeply believe that this was another conspiracy of Queen Madara. But Archbishop Philip did not turn his head and replied calmly, "It's not that bad, Count. The scene you saw earlier was us trying to find a way to seal the goddess, but there's not much time. Her Majesty the Queen will explain all this to you." "You can seal your goddess, the clone of the legendary Martha?" Brando asked sarcastically. "Clyce is not the clone of Lady Martha. That's just a rumor. Count, the undead believe in Martha only because we are the same as you, the people of order." "We are not the same as you cold-blooded and heartless guys," Brando replied. "Did you plan all this from the beginning?" "Plan? What good does this do for us?" "You mean to make me believe that all this happened by chance?" "That's not entirely true." In the smoke, a somewhat hoarse voice suddenly replied. Brando frowned and looked up. He saw a woman's figure coming out of the smoke. He recognized at a glance that it was Queen Madara, but the latter was alone and seemed to be injured. She pressed her chest with one hand and supported herself against the wall with the other. She limped to the front of everyone. When she completely revealed herself from the smoke, Brando could not help but be stunned. Queen Madara was originally wearing a long black dress, but this dress was now in tatters. There was a long opening on one side, like a Chong Sam, revealing her snow-white thighs. But Brando was not in the mood to appreciate this scene, because Her Majesty the Queen's face was now covered in blood. Her face was hideous and one of her eyes was closed. Blood kept flowing down her neck, chest and arms, causing the soaked dress to cling tightly to her body. Brando could not help but raise his eyebrows. "What's going on?" "I had a fight with Goddess Clyce," Her Majesty the Queen said in a hoarse voice, but she did not hide her words. "You had a fight with the goddess?" Brando asked in disbelief. "Only one blow. Not even one blow. With all due respect, even I am not sure if I can take a blow from a god." "Your Majesty, are you joking with me?" "No, this joke is not funny at all." Her Majesty the Queen replied coldly, "Clyce wanted to descend, but I blocked her with a sacrificial spell." "Sacrificial spell?" Brendel sucked in a breath of cold air. He suddenly remembered the believers and high-ranking priests in the undead moon temple. He stared at the two of them with his mouth agape, and finally understood the coldness and ruthlessness of the undead. Chapter 1335. With a clear shout, the battle between Huang Hua and the descendant of Clyce was finally over. The little girl's sword pierced through the shadow's forehead. She threw away the sword, took a step back and punched the shadow in the chest. Flames gushed out from her fist and instantly turned the monster into ashes. Amidst the monster's shrill scream, Huang Hua put away her sword and took 2 steps back. She gently exhaled and looked up. First, she looked at her hand strangely, then looked in the direction of Brando and the others. At this time, the dispute between Brando and Queen Madara had come to an end. The latter did not disappoint him and explained the whole story to him. First of all, she frankly admitted that she had known about the fall of Clyce a long time ago. That was before the battle between Madara's Grand Prince Hofentos and the Crystal Cluster. However, when the will of the goddess broke through the wall, it was not something she could decide. The reason why Brando and the others happened to bump into this matter was partly because of the coincidence, and partly because of Bai's deliberate arrangement. However, Brando felt that there was something wrong. According to what Huang Hua said, Bai should have known the whole story long ago. However, their encounter at Fathom Harbor was just a coincidence. At that time, the Dragon Queen had not launched her plan, and he had not gone to the elemental frontier. The will of the Twilight Dragon had not yet awakened in the Roman body, let alone invade this world. If that was the case, how could Bai have arranged everything in advance, not to mention the agreement between her and the queen? However, Queen Madara only shook her head and told him that things were not as he thought. She said, although the Dragon Queen's plan had not entered the final stage at that time, don't forget that the plan of the tree herders is not a sudden idea. Their plan has been traceable for thousands of years. It may be difficult for others to come into contact with these things, but Bai is different. She is one of the 12 tree herders. You mean Bai appeared at Fathom Harbor because she knew that I would go there and compete with her for the War Slate and the Pearl of Darkness? I thought you had a brain, Count, Queen Madara replied, rolling her eyes. Brando heard Delphian giggling behind him. He turned his head and looked at his troublesome think tank, but he still couldn't figure out what was wrong with his words. He knew that there were some abilities in Won that could predict the future, but this ability was not as effective as what the astrologers claimed. The prediction of the future was more like a prediction of a trend. It was then revealed to the mortals through a hazy oracle, and then translated by a prophet. It was considered good if it was 20% or 30% credible. It might be able to predict the development and direction of things for a period of time, but it was basically impossible to accurately predict a person and where he would appear in the future. Even a god like Goddess Helene, who was in charge of fate, her function was only to reveal the fate of mortals, not to arrange and control their future. Legend had it that her sister, the thread manipulator Alice, had such an ability, but it was only a legend after all. Queen Madara saw that Howrin didn't understand, so she replied, no one in this world can predict such things, not even God. But we don't need to predict these things. Don't need to? Brando was stunned for a moment, but he wasn't too stupid, at least in the eyes of Queen Madara. He finally understood. You mean, Madame Bai wasn't after me in the first place? Nonsense, Queen Madara replied snappily. Before that, we didn't even know who you were. Bai was there for the Dragon Queen's plan. In fact, the reason why Madara was there was because of the agreement between me and the Silver Queen. Brando thought for a moment and remembered that it seemed to be true. The rotten knight Krot, who betrayed Madara, seemed to have told him the same thing. He believed that the small fry wouldn't dare to deceive him. However, Queen Madara's aggressive tone made him feel a little embarrassed, as if he was too self-righteous. But this was human nature. Everyone naturally put themselves in the shoes of others when considering a problem, especially when the matter was directly related to them. Fortunately, Delphian seemed to have finally remembered which side she was on. She smiled and helped Brando ask, but Your Majesty, Ms. Bai's plan later changed. You probably didn't know about it, but you didn't seem surprised, did you? Otherwise, why did you not hesitate to give the Mercury staff to us? Brando finally raised his head and looked at Queen Madara. Although he didn't want to admit it, he had to admit that the Prime Minister's daughter had asked the question he wanted to ask the most. Queen Madara glanced at Delphian before replying, this has to do with my agreement with Bai. I'd like to hear more. There's one thing you already know, Mr. Count. The plan of the Silver Queen and the Dragon Queen originated from the agreement between Odin and the four sages in the era of the War of the Holy Saints. As the Holy Ones, they were the ones who kept the agreement. Their goal was to complete the unfinished plan of the Dark Dragon. Whether this plan succeeds or not, we have to at least put it into practice, because we can't judge whether what we're doing now is right or wrong. Queen Madara raised her head and looked at him sarcastically. Not everyone can be like you, firmly believing that what they have chosen is right, especially when this choice is related to the future of our world. Hasty self-adherence and stubbornness will only lead us to eternal damnation. Are you wiser than the divine people? Or are you more far-sighted than the gods? You've got one thing wrong, Your Majesty. What I insist on is not right but justice, Brando replied, shaking his head. And it is precisely because there are so many meanings of right and justice that we should exercise the power it gives us with caution. We should let more people participate in it, to make decisions and make judgments. I think this is what the gods want for our future. I don't want to convince you, Mr. Count, Queen Madara replied. But I hope you remember what I said earlier. It's not my original idea but a principle. You should have heard from Bai about the various major organizations of the divine people, but you still don't understand how they work, do you? Brando thought to himself that he had already heard about how the divine people were organized, but not from Bai, but from Lady White Mist and Ovina. But he still nodded patiently. The power of the twilight is so strong. In the darkest of times, the gods had already foreseen their fall and the end of the Golden Age. These great consciousnesses realized a problem. After they passed away, how could their successors not make mistakes? The sound of collapsing buildings came from afar. Dark clouds surged in the sky above the city of the dead. Occasionally, a bolt of lightning would streak across the sky, splitting into countless tiny branches and striking the ground. The lightning lit up the eyes of everyone present. Soon, the sound of people yelling to put out the fire came from afar. In the center of the city of the dead, in the most densely populated area of Madara, for a moment, it looked no different from Rushta. But Queen Madara didn't seem to care about her kingdom or what kind of disaster her people were suffering. She only calmly told a story from the past. Mr. Count, when the gods were still alive, when the divine people were at their most glorious days, our world would still make mistakes in the face of the twilight, let alone after they passed away. You only need to imagine, in the days when the great consciousnesses weren't protecting us, a small mistake could lead us to eternal damnation. Under such circumstances, Mother couldn't help but have such a thought: how could she let her children continue to fight against the Twilight Dragon after she left? Brando thought of the great consciousnesses and his heart wavered. She was the mother of all things. In the legends of the Pale Poem, she did indeed have such a great heart. She was an omnipotent existence that surpassed all wills and wisdom. However, she had personally bestowed a spirit to this world and created her children. She had also sacrificed everything for them. For the creatures of Wond, was there anything more noble than this? How did Mother do it? That's history from countless eons ago. Who could possibly know about it? But after that, the gods and the divine people agreed on a principle, and the arbiter's eye was thus established. Its duty was to supervise. This principle was that no matter what, no matter how big or small, as long as it could determine the future of our world and change the fate of our world, we must judge it with suspicion. No matter how right it seems on the surface or how crazy or absurd it is, as long as there is a possibility, we must be prepared. Countless years later, we don't know if this was Mother's decision. Queen Madara shook her head and said, but this decision led to many things. One of them was the split between the Truth Parliament and the World Tree. All for One and tree herders were born as a result, and this was one of the reasons for the arrival of the mortal era. The divine people argued and finally decided to follow this principle and split into two. Chapter 1336. The queen raised her head, and a purple light seemed to be reflected in the depths of her eyes. She replied softly, that's why you see the descendants of the divine people, the gold and silver people, handing over their authority to the mortals. On the other hand, the tree herders are recreating the bloodline of the divine people. Even someone as arrogant as my father was hesitant in this plan, and he was eventually defeated by the four sages. Brando finally understood what was going on, but he still could not understand this logic. In a situation where their own strength was not enough to resist external aggression, it was ridiculous to divide their limited power. The queen turned her head and looked at Brando. Do you find it difficult to understand, Count Brando? From the perspective of ordinary people, it is indeed so, but are the ancestors and the sages really that ignorant? The problem is that if we choose a wrong path, the more we advance on this path, the closer we are to destruction. We cannot judge whether we are right or wrong, so when one side chooses this path, the other side has the obligation to observe and evaluate how this plan will ultimately lead us to. At the same time, they have to be prepared to stop the whole plan at any time. This does sound a little ridiculous, but this ridiculousness is based on the confusion and uneasiness of our lowly selves, just because we can't see any hope. Think about it. Everyone is preparing for a war that is bound to be lost. We have to invest in many sides in order to carefully maintain the survival of this world. So I really envy you ignorant mortals. It is because of your ignorance that you can go on fearlessly. It is as if there will always be a sunrise tomorrow, and hope will always exist. But in reality, the sun has long been extinguished. Perhaps tomorrow, it will never rise again. For those who know all this, this is a matter of despair, but they can't make it public. Just like a father and mother in a family, they have to support the family alone and protect their children. My father and my mother shoulder this responsibility, and I have been surrounded by this nightmare since the moment I was born. Count Brando, can you understand the feelings of a group of people like us? Her Majesty the Queen stopped, then opened her mouth again and said, Count Brando, I'm sorry to let you know these things. I didn't want to disturb your beautiful dream, but like I said, since you have chosen this path, you have to bear this responsibility. Brando let out a long sigh. He was silent for a long time. Until an aftershock swept through the silent death sanctuary, and the ground trembled. A temple not far from here collapsed, and the sound of the building collapsing could still be heard clearly from hundreds of meters away. It was as if many descendants of Kleist had descended into this world. The sound of fighting came from the distance. It should be the Black Knight regiment of the undead attacking the temple. A shadow monster scuttled in from the corner. Brando reached out and grabbed its throat from dozens of meters away, crushing the monster into pieces. Queen Madara saw this scene, and the depths of her eyes lit up. This young count was only one step away from becoming a sage. That day on the battlefield of Finhodos, she gave him access to Tiamat, which seemed to be of great help to him. There is no such thing as a beautiful dream in this world. You think of mortals as too weak, Your Majesty. Brando opened his palm and replied indifferently, I was born in a remote village in Erewhon, so remote that you might not have heard of the name of this place before you planned to invade this kingdom. But before I came of age, I lived in the shadow of your army. Perhaps I was carefree when I was young, but I could feel the fear and hatred of the undead in the eyes of the people around me. Ever since the blood staff swept through eastern Karsuk, do you know how many years the people of Erewhon have succumbed to the coldness and majesty of the Mercury staff? Ever since the War of the Black Rose, do you know how many Butchie people have been displaced and how many people have lost their families in this war? For the fathers of those children, the husbands of those wives, dying in this final war is no different from dying under the butcher's knife of your army. The despair and fear in their hearts is no different. In those dark days, everyone had to struggle to survive. Where is their hope? Brando turned his head and looked at Her Majesty, just like the king of the mortal world who has to be careful of a sharp blade at all times, or be killed by a cup of poisoned wine. The farmers of the mortal world have to be constantly worried about their harvest in the coming year. There are also wars and all kinds of man-made disasters. In this world where we can only survive with difficulty, who can be independent? I express my regret for your experience, Your Majesty. Although I also admire Lord Odin, this does not mean that we are weak people. Yes, I am just a mortal lord. Even if in the eyes of the farmers in my territory, I may be high and mighty, but in your eyes, I may not be any different from them. Everyone is more or less arrogant and prideful, and occasionally I have such thoughts. Brando took out a handkerchief from his pocket and unfolded it. We don't know much. The legends of the past are as distant as myths to us. We don't know that there are people in this world who bear a lot of things and are fighting for us like Miss Andrea and Lord Odin. They are the most noble people in this world, but... He handed the handkerchief to Queen Madara. It's no different for us. It's not as complicated as you think. It's just a war. Anyone can die in this war, including me and you. But at least I can promise you one thing. I will definitely die before you, Your Majesty. Wipe your face. Queen Madara looked at the white handkerchief in Brando's hand and then looked up at Brando. His face was serious and serious. You're right. The sun may not rise tomorrow and our world may be destroyed in the very next moment, but there's nothing to worry about. I'm prepared to fight and die for it. As long as there are no regrets, it's not as terrible as imagined, is it not? Queen Madara hesitated for a moment and silently took the handkerchief from his hand. But she did not move. She just clenched the handkerchief tightly. Well, Brando looked at the queen and replied, I believe what you said is true. But now it is your turn to make me believe, Your Majesty. About my plan with White? About everything. Her Majesty frowned as Philip stood beside her. She hesitated for a while before replying, just like the principle I told you before, the agreement between Odin and the four sages. If there is an executor, there will naturally be an overseer, and I am that overseer. This plan was not born in a day. It has existed for a long time. My father, Odin, represented the will of the Truth Parliament. In fact, it was a continuation of the era of the gods. The powerful Myrna Empire ruled the world with the power of the gold and silver people to resist the Twilight Dragon. And the Tree Herder's plan went one step further, to recreate the gods and return to the era of the gods. After the outbreak of the War of the Holy Saints, because of the agreement between the gods and the gods, my father did not want to cut off the hope of the mortals. So he eventually failed. But he made a promise with the mortals and the Tree Herders, and that was the gamble 1,000 years later. Still because of that principle? Queen Madara nodded. The reason why it had to wait 1,000 years was because my father wanted to give the mortals a chance to reproduce. They were too weak at that time. My father revealed part of the past and future to the four sages. After understanding Won's fate, the sages agreed to this agreement. As the one who fulfilled the agreement, Eloranta chose to become the Holy Saint. And Gretel left his holy sword and brought it out of Cruz. Saint Tassol, the Wind Empress, turned into a heroic spirit. She glanced at Brando. You received the inheritance of Saint Tassol, right? If I'm not mistaken, Mr. Count? Brando was shocked. This was the first time someone saw through his secret, but he did not deny it. He just nodded silently. Fanzan should also have left something behind, but this sage of the four sages has always been a man of few words. We have no way of knowing what he left behind. I heard that in the last days of his life he seemed to have seen something. Some people said that he left this world and went to a distant place, but I don't know if it's true." Hearing this, Brando understood most of it. He said, "So you and Haku already knew about the Dragon Queen's plan, but you didn't stop her. You just made some preparations outside of this plan. Is that right?" "Yes, because I have to represent the other side of this principle. When the Dragon Queen's plan failed, I had to ensure the feasibility of another plan." "What plan?" "I don't know. This plan was born out of the establishment of Wond when he was still immortal. Wond's mortal was first proposed by the Truth Symposium, but the Truth Symposium eventually split because of this. I only know its name. It's called the Wond Plan." "The Wond Plan?" Brando's memory fragments seemed to be floating in his mind, like sparks of fire. "The second half of this plan was actually out of the control of the gods. Another great will took over, but it didn't leave a name. I think it might be Martha, but it could also be another god. Because this plan was carried out in secret, even its executors didn't understand what it meant. Because of this, it was placed after all the other plans. Even my parents only left a glimmer of hope for it according to the oracle. This glimmer of hope was the Roman, your merchant lady." "What? So, do you understand now? It is because of the existence of that great will that the Twilight Dragon's mortal body, that is, your fiancée, was not killed. An oracle was sent down at the last moment, allowing the Truth Symposium to pass a resolution to preserve her until the generation of my father and mother. But why? As I said, I don't know. It's only related to a promise left by Martha. Mother left a hope for all of us." Brando raised Odorfice in his hand. "Is this all?" "That's all," Madara replied. "That's why White went to the Metz region, other than to fulfill his promise to keep an eye on the Dragon Queen and the White Queen's plan. He was also looking for the legendary Orb of Darkness that was lost in the eastern Metz region." She looked at the handkerchief in her hand, picked it up, and gently wiped the blood on her face. "So because of the Dragon Queen's plan, she will definitely go out of the elemental domain. For us Watchers, we will only calculate the failure of the plan, and not what will happen if it succeeds. But as for why we met you, Mr. Count, perhaps this is the hope that Lady Martha left for us. Because this is our destiny." Chapter 1337. The earth hummed in resonance, and a long streak of lightning formed a distant scene in the dark sky. After the War of the Fifth Era, the gods began to leave our world. The last to leave was Martha. This was the twilight of the gods. This was the prophecy of the gods. They passed this world to the descendants of the gods, and when the blood of the gods that flowed on the earth became thinner and thinner, one day the generation of gold and silver would replace them. After the age of silver, the age of black iron would come. In the Truth Parliament, the descendants of the divine people found a child with a pure bloodline in the depths of Gaia's will in order to revive the glorious era. When this child was chosen by the will of Dusk, Dusk hoped to use her to steal the same level of authority as Marcia. It projected a part of its will into our world and merged with the child's soul. When it came, it was discovered by the will. Our plan began to take shape from that era. The child survived and was passed down from generation to generation until my parents met with an accident. My father and the four sages agreed on everything 1,000 years later, but they hid the existence of the child. 1,000 years later, on the final battlefield, your grandfather found her again. You already know everything that happened after that. When the Dragon Queen's plan failed, the will of the Twilight Dragon awakened in our world. With the blood of the ancestors, it seized the authority of our world. It found the place where the gods died and brought them back from the void. But what it brought back was no longer the great will that cared for us and protected us, but the will of chaos, puppets and empty shells that were controlled by the Twilight Dragon. Just yesterday the stars of Wond had been extinguished forever, replaced by the rising constellation of the dragon god Bahamut. After tens of thousands of years, it shone again in the sky of Wond. The gods have returned, but what they brought was not glory and hope, but cold and lifeless despair. Madara put down her handkerchief and replied coldly. The white handkerchief was stained with blood. This is blasphemy. Andrea couldn't help but shout. Although she was the one who suggested this possibility to Brando, when she heard the truth, as a member of the Earth Legion and the most devout warrior of the gods and their people, she couldn't help but lose control of her emotions. In fact, Mr. Liu and the others were also in disbelief. They knew even less about the inside story of Twilight Descent. Although they had gradually learned some things along the way, they had never been so straightforward and shocking. Everyone was silent. Wang Hua took 2 steps and stopped. He looked at his teacher worriedly. How are the dragons? For some reason, Allah's figure appeared in front of Brando's eyes. That willful little female dragon, just like when they parted ways in Ampere Seal. Her golden curly hair was shining, and her eyes were full of slyness. But after a while, another girl who was even quieter appeared in his mind. She had long snow-white hair and wore a pair of teardrop-shaped earrings. She was frowning and glaring at him. Humans, you're shameless. Brando's heart suddenly felt empty. After a moment of silence, he let out a long sigh. The dragons have no future, Queen Madara replied. They may still be able to survive, but without the protection of the dragon god, their bloodline will soon become thin, and no new dragons will be born. Perhaps in 1,000 years, the mortals will see the last dragon in this world close its eyes. Of course, if we can wait until that day. So, in the end, what is your countermeasure? Yes, in my opinion, we still have 2 ways. Queen Madara looked at him, a deep light flashing in the depths of her purple eyes. One way is to restart this world just like what the gods did in the past. Although the Twilight Dragon has seized power, we also have a new Martha. The Twilight Dragon was sealed by the Holy One, and is one of the 3 remaining supreme authorities. As long as you and Ekis agree, we will start again. But it is foreseeable that in the next era, our power will be even weaker. Not to mention, Ekis' power will be unstoppable. Mortals may be enslaved by it, but at least the civilization can continue to pass on. Ekis came to see me, Brando replied. She said this to me, but I will not agree. I will not agree to this path. Then there is only one other way. In the prophecy, a great king will come to our world. He will open Martha's treasury and guide his people. The will of the gods will crown him in the clouds. At that moment, the whole world will sing for him. He will defeat the Twilight Dragon, and our world will usher in an incomparably bright future. Brando looked at Queen Madara, and their eyes met in mid-air. The will of the master of the Mercury Staff was firm and unshakable. Brando's eyes were also calm, as if thousands of years had passed in his eyes. At this moment he saw history, the present, and the future at the same time. But there was only one answer. And that answer he had already decided. If it were you, Your Majesty, what would you choose? Just like your father? No, now the world depends on your choice, Count. Brando sighed and shook his head. You have already decided? I have already decided, haven't I, Your Majesty? At this moment, many people in this world are also making their own decisions. These decisions may not be important to Wand, but in the end they will change the course of history. Queen Madara thought of Brando's words, but she was obviously not satisfied with the answer. Wand needed a king, not a brave warrior. Don't talk big, she said, thinking of her father. I know your determination and will, but your death will not help this world. What we need is not faith and ideals, but the strength to resist the Twilight Dragon. But if we do not have faith and ideals, and if the civilized world does not have order and compassion for the weak, even if we defeat the Twilight Dragon, what difference will there be between our world and chaos? Don't change the topic, Your Majesty. The problem now is that we have no way to defeat the Twilight Dragon. The Queen's tone began to contain anger. Your Majesty, Brando's tone was very gentle. If I am the supreme monarch you speak of, like your father in your memory, perhaps one day this world will defeat the Twilight Dragon under my rule, but in the next era, it will face the same predicament as us. Do the people in every era have to hope for a savior to save them? This is the so-called era of mortals? Your Majesty, Brando sighed, do not forget, as long as order is not destroyed, the Twilight Dragon will not die. 1,000 years ago your father used his death to prove this cycle. What happened to the kingdom founded by the 4 wise men? The title of the fool is a heavy honorific because it tells us that what we need is not only the wise men who created an era. He shook his head. I think we have made a lot of mistakes in the past. In the future I see, people no longer need the wise men and nobles, nor do they need the divine people and the gods. In that era the gods are no longer and the heroes are gone. Mortals will move forward by themselves, opening a difficult path in the thorns and darkness. Perhaps that era will be very humble, and order will be like a weak candle flame in the long night. But at least the road ahead will not be the Twilight Dragon, but the dawn, and hope will be eternal. It sounds wonderful, but what about the Twilight Dragon? Brando was silent for a moment. His eyes flashed with a strange light, as if he had seen everything he had seen in the elemental frontier. He saw Miss Tata and the Holy Ones looking at him expectantly. He saw Lord Saint Tassel nodding gently at him. He even saw the majestic figure, his grandfather, Earth Sword Saint Darius. The old man did not say a word. He just turned around silently, bent down to pick up his sword from the ground, and left Brendel with a silent back view. There was something in his eyes that was not there before. It was as if after he got the answer, he only had the determination to move forward. "I promise all of you," Brendel enunciated each word clearly to the Madara Queen and everyone present, "everything that I see will come true." Queen Madara wanted to refute. But when she saw Brendel's expression, the words that were about to come out of her mouth lost their strength and became pale. She silently shut her mouth. "I promise you, Sophie. Everything will be fine." In the darkness, two tall figures turned around and resolutely walked out of the hall. There, the Myrna Imperial Guard stood still. In the army, Kelsey and Tumen were waiting. "I believe in you, teacher," a somewhat young voice replied. Huang Ho walked to Brando's side. She held her sword in her hand and answered without any doubt. "I believe in you too, my lord." Andrea whispered behind Brando, "I have seen the darkest times. The battle seemed to be endless. We won again and again, but the hope was getting slimmer and slimmer. Finally you are back. I believe that you must be the one to bring us hope." Mr. Liu and Philip did not speak. One of them did not understand what she said, and the other seemed to be indifferent to all of this. Delphian frowned and remained silent, as if she was thinking about something. Only Fang Qi was beaming with joy. No one knew what he was excited about. Chapter 1338. Queen Madara took a deep breath and said, "Well, if this is the path you have chosen, I hope you won't regret it. You are the master recognized by the holy swords, the one promised by Martha. I don't know if it's right or wrong to give you the Mercury staff, but I respect your choice." She paused for a moment before continuing, "But no matter what you want to do, you must get the 7 holy swords. Now I'll tell you where the orb of nature is." Brando held his breath. In fact, when he saw Fang Qi and Phoenix Flame, he had already guessed the purpose of the Queen's summons. After all, she had sent Insursta and Tarkus to Rosaline to contact the Ghost Chariot, which meant that Madara should have already known the existence of the mystery of the Emerald. "But before that, I have something to tell you." Her Majesty's tone became cold again. She gently threw the handkerchief on the ground. "Oenlos is dead, Bahamut should have come to the world, and the gods everywhere will come one after another. In addition, although the will of the twilight is temporarily sealed, its claws and teeth have begun to attack. For us, war has already come, so whether you are willing to bear this responsibility or not, the whole civilized world must unite to fight, or we will not have another chance." Brando glanced at her unhappily. "But at this time, the undead of Madara are invading Erewhon and fighting the Wind Elves of Saint Tassol. No, now Erewhon no longer has my army, you should understand this. What's more, the so-called War of the Black Roses broke out because of something else. I will tell you the reason sooner or later, and who told you that we are fighting the Wind Elves? You are not fighting Saint Tassol? Are we crazy?" Brando was taken aback. In history, Madara fought Erewhon and Saint Tassol at the same time in the Second War of the Black Roses, and Erewhon was not the main battlefield of the Second War of the Black Roses. It was not as deadly to the kingdom as the later Battle of the Oblique Forest and the Battle of Cypher. In fact, the Second War of the Black Roses in history referred to the war between the undead and the Wind Elves. Although the undead did not have much of an advantage in that war, Queen Madara used it to consolidate her authority and consume the forces that opposed her in the empire. But he only froze for a moment before he realized that his thoughts were somewhat bound by the history of the Amber Sword. In history, although Madara might also be at war with the Crystal Cluster, it was not as urgent as it was now. After all, in the game, Vaunt had steadily transitioned to the middle of the Second Era. Although it had experienced the Slate War and the Calamity of Wolves, it did not look like it was on the verge of collapse at that time. Under such circumstances, it was unlikely that Madara would divide her forces to deal with Saint Tassol. But he was a little speechless. Why was the owner of the Mercury Staff so obsessed with Erewhon? Why would she start a war for him when she was under attack from both sides? After all, the First War of the Black Roses could be explained as a war for her to establish her authority, but the Second War of the Black Roses had no meaning, especially when the undead did not attack the Wind Elves of Saint Tassol. Brando really could not see any strategic intentions. "In that case, Your Majesty, what do you plan to do? We must ensure that before you find the 7 keys, this world will not fall, and the seal of the Twilight Dragon is our last chance. But this time, the will to protect this world is no longer there, and even the gods are standing on the opposite side of us. Only the mortal world is left. To be honest, I don't know if our desperate gamble will succeed. If there is no other choice, we have to ask Ekis for help. Brando shook his head. That was not what he wanted, but he already understood what the Queen meant. So, the world of order needs an alliance that can connect the people of Erewhon, the people of Cruz, the people of Fanzan, and the Wind Elves, the 4 holy temples, and all the intelligent races in this world. Just like the sacred covenant 1,000 years ago, the mortals will once again fight for their own destiny. Queen Madara nodded slowly. She replied, although this is far from what I originally envisioned, this is the only way. Fanzan and Eloranta have already formed an alliance, and Saint Tassol's attitude is unclear. Between the 4 of us, we need a middle force to connect them. I originally hoped that the people of Cruz could block the will of the Twilight Dragon, and then the Silver Folk would call for this alliance. Unfortunately, the people of Cruz have lost this opportunity, and the Silver Folk will soon face their own troubles. But your proposal reminds me that maybe you are a better choice. You want the people of Erewhon to lead this alliance. Delphian suddenly reacted and asked in disbelief. Brando immediately reacted. The Queen's intention was still on him. But this time he pondered for a moment and did not object. He only asked, what should we do? Queen Madara was slightly stunned, as if the prepared speech did not come in handy. Do you think I will object? Brando saw the look on the Queen's face. The Queen looked at him with her purple eyes, and after a long while she replied, you should understand that an alliance is not the best choice, and the best way to integrate the power of the civilized world is an empire. And everyone will support you, the descendants of Fanzan, Gretel, Saint Tassol, and Eloranta. They will not oppose you because you are the chosen one of this world. Martha, our mother will personally crown you. Brando smiled. The world of civilization and order will stand together, just as described in the Sacred Covenant. Your Majesty, if people need a flag, I will stand in front of everyone. This is my responsibility, but it is not to decide their fate in life and death. Do people really need a high and mighty monarch? Queen Madara was speechless. Let's not talk about this first, but I want to hear your thoughts, Your Majesty. The Queen hesitated for a moment before replying. It's actually very simple. I hope that the civilized world will believe in us. I will let the undead army pass through their land and join their camp. Resist the army of Dusk in the Alkash Mountains. This is our only chance. Brando gasped. Resist the army of Dusk in the Alkash Mountains? What about the Sea of the Dying Moon? Are you planning to give up the Sea of the Dying Moon? Kleist will descend on this land. Without the protection of the goddess of the Dying Moon, this land will no longer mean anything to us. Perhaps one day we will return, but that will be after we have won. The Great Migration of the Undead, this phrase flashed through Brando's mind. He thought for a moment. Erewhon's people had to act as Madara's envoys to persuade the various countries. This was not easy to accomplish, and the time given to them was limited. However, the master of the Mercury Staff had stopped invading Erewhon at the last moment. Perhaps this, coupled with the performance of Erewhon's people, would more or less gain some trust in the countries of the living, but overall, it was still not optimistic. And Brando knew very well that even Erewhon's people themselves might not be able to accept Madara's kindness. Hundreds of years of being blinded by hatred was not something that could be changed overnight. Besides, he could not lead all of this himself. All of this had to be handed over to Princess Griffin and Haruz, and perhaps the eldest son of the king. He hoped that they could persuade Erewhon's people to take on this responsibility. Thinking of this, he asked, do I have time to go back to Erewhon? The Queen of Madara shook her head. Not so much time. This is why I asked you to summon your goddess of war. You must find the nature's orb before Kleist descends. But Freya just left. Can't Medisha and Hippamera do the job? Fuchsia wants to take them away. Can you persuade her? Brando did not say anything. Putting aside whether he could persuade the Seven-Pole Dragon King, he could see that Medisha and Hippamera wanted to become stronger. At this time he had to respect their choice. Don't worry, we still have some time. After Kleist was defeated by us, she will not come again for a while. Although this time is not enough for you to go back to Erewhon to arrange everything, at least you can wait until your goddess of war arrives. I have asked the Holy Sanctum to build a portal that can send you to the center of the Sea of the Dying Moon. But this portal is one way. After you leave, we will also leave this place. I will bring your followers with me, and then we will meet in Algash. If we can meet again. Brando knew that a long-distance portal could not be built overnight. Obviously, Her Majesty had been preparing for this for a long time. Queen Madara knew what he was thinking and replied, the undead have a detailed record of the mystery of the emerald. I have always known that it is in the center of the Sea of the Dying Moon. But to open it, You need the blood of the 9 Phoenix royal family. As for how to persuade your student and that guy, she raised her chin and signaled to Fang Qi, then you will have to rely on yourself. The people of the 9 Phoenix will not back down at this time. We will join this sacred covenant. Huang He finally found a chance to speak. I will also help my teacher. As she spoke, she looked at Mr. Liu, who nodded slightly at her. This is the price of the sacred jade sword, Fang Qi thought for a moment and said, if I am not wrong, Mr. Count, you have been plotting against me for a long time, right? Brando looked at him, but the latter looked at Delphian and said, Mr. Fang Qi, please respect yourself. The Prime Minister's daughter replied coldly. Fang Qi scratched his head and shrugged. Brando thought for a moment and asked, I have another question, Your Majesty. You said that Oenlos has fallen. I want to ask what happened to the Cruz Empire and what happened to the dragon? It's just a fiasco, Madara replied coldly. The Dusk's minions have opened a hole in the Kurlutz Empire, and from there, they will be able to take advantage of the situation and head south. The Farnezans and Atlanta's elves are fighting against the Nose army in the Great Glacier. The Kurlutz and the dragons have already lost, and the Bugis can't even take care of themselves. The Wind Elves alone won't be able to stop the Dusk's army, so my army and I must enter the Alkash Mountains before that. The Bugis can't take care of themselves? Brando was stunned for a moment, then suddenly reacted, the Slate War broke out. The Slate War. Queen Madara looked at him suspiciously. You seem to know something? Brando realized that he had said something wrong and quickly corrected himself. You let Tariq go to Alkash before that because of this reason? Not only that, Her Majesty fell into his trap, of course. It was more likely that she didn't care in the first place. Perhaps when you see Yalvit, you will understand why. She and Tariq met someone there, and now she is in Erewhon with your men. Humph, I already knew that this woman has been looking for the whereabouts of Valhalla. Chapter 1340. In the twilight forest outside the land of everlasting death, the dark river was shrouded in thick fog. The sound of flowing water could be heard as the waves passed through the rocks in the river and formed a whirlpool. The twigs and driftwood that flowed down from the upper reaches of the river swirled and sank to the bottom of the river. Occasionally, 1 or 2 white lines could be seen in the dark night. A battle was taking place on the riverbank. March of the Unending Army. Fuchsia was like a lone peak in the forest. A card glowing with black light was spinning on its 7th horn. When it finally stopped, it revealed the scene of an army of spectral mercenaries marching across the dark plains. Countless skeletons were crawling out from the ground. Mud was peeling off from their bodies, revealing their white skeletons. These filthy evil spirits stood up shakily from the riverbank. From afar, a terrifying phosphorescence could be seen surging towards the other side of the battlefield, Medisha and Hippamera. Heaven's armor. The Silver Elf Princess also threw out a card. She stretched out her hand, and the card instantly hung in midair. Silver light gathered as if the light of the world was added to it. On the surface of the card, above the holy clouds, a beam of light pierced down like a sharp sword. Just as the card described, when the light of judgment plows through the battlefield, the undead army will be reduced to ashes. The planeswalker's power resonated with the entire world. The 3 of them looked up and saw a golden cloud suddenly appear in the dark night sky. Above the cloud there was a light that no one could look at. The light shone into the forest and covered the riverbank. Holy flames immediately ignited on the riverbank, and the undead howled and melted in the flames, turning into ashes. It was as if judgment had descended upon the world. Fuchsia nodded. A hint of cunning flashed in her golden eyes. She spoke, the 5 colors of dawn can be transformed into any color. It can be used in many different ways in a battle based on the cards of fate that I have. In this battle, I will use the agile and reckless red creatures to attack you. The red creatures are easily angered and weak. Once their attacks are thwarted, they will leave a large number of corpses in the graveyard. The Unending Army can transform all the creatures in the graveyard into level 10 black spectral mercenaries. They may look weak in your eyes, but a planeswalker's power is not only limited to creatures and spells. Her voice rumbled in the forest and startled a flock of birds. They flapped their wings and flew into the night sky. But she did not seem to hear anything. She raised her golden claw and showed the next card. Vengeance. Balls of white light rose from the ashes of the undead creatures. They looked like ghostly flames in the dark. Fuchsia pointed her claw at Medisha. Countless balls of light flew towards Medisha. The Silver Elf Princess could not dodge in time and was hit in the chest. Blood spurted out of her mouth as she was sent flying. Miss Priestess screamed in fright and rushed over to help Medisa up. Hippamera, I'm fine. Medicia's face was pale. Blood was dripping from the corner of her mouth. It took her a long time to catch her breath. She forced a smile that looked worse than crying and replied weakly. She let out a sigh and looked at Wuxia from afar. I lost again, Your Majesty. That's normal. I inherited my planeswalker powers from the same era as Odin, Tumen, and Kelsey. It would be ridiculous if I couldn't even defeat 2 planeswalkers. But do you know why you lost, little princess? Fuchsia replied. Medicia shook her head. Your cards have powerful spells and excellent creatures, and they complement each other. Every card can be considered powerful, but this is far from enough because the power of a planeswalker is not built on a few powerful cards. You are a knight. Do you understand your position in your master's deck? Knight? What is a knight, little princess? Fuchsia raised her head. Her golden eyes were like 2 full moons in the night sky. Her voice echoed throughout the forest. A knight is a noble of the border. You are the minister of the king. You are the leader of your subjects. You are the lord, the soldier, and the ruler. Every time the king blows his horn and summons you to fight for him, you must raise your flag, mount your war horse, and fight for honor. So this is my role in the Lord's all-class system. Medicia suddenly understood. Her silver eyes shone brightly. That's right. Your position in the full-time card dominator group is a solid supporter, and the white color that Brendel set for you is suitable for you. White is the color of justice, and in the world of planeswalkers, it symbolizes law, order, and organization. White mana is contained in the planes. It symbolizes wealth and prosperity. White cards have excellent and cheap soldiers, monks, and angels. It symbolizes honor and loyalty. So as the king's knight, you must repay your planeswalker with self-discipline, wealth, loyalty, and honor. You are the cornerstone of this system. The prosperity of the knight deck symbolizes the prosperity of the kingdom. Only with endless wealth can the other decks become richer. Your self-discipline and loyalty can awaken the creatures on the battlefield. You use your honor to lead them to fight for the king. So the most suitable deck for you is the pure white barrier deck. Medicia had a pensive look on her face. What about me, Your Majesty Dragon King? Hippamera asked quickly. She looked at the cleric. Gray represents stability, determination, and protection. Gray cards are strong in defense but weak in attack. It is slightly cumbersome. Although you are the cleric of Himalud, you don't have to restrict yourself to a fixed way of thinking. I will send you to the Temple of Yahweh Island. There is a long-lost mountain sanctuary there. Before the year of eradication, the clerics there faced the power of the raging sea every day. You will understand the fusion of the earth and the sea there and learn to use the gray and blue control deck. When do we leave? Medicia suddenly asked. She raised her head and stared at the dark sky with her golden eyes. Ever since the necropolis of Waning Moon 3 days ago, the fire had never been extinguished. The sky was dyed red by the flames as if it was the end of the world. 1 week later. How long will the trial take, Your Majesty Dragon King? Not too long. The trial will be completed in the realm of time of the people of Madatanya. The long time there is only a moment in the prime material plane. You will be able to complete the trial in half a month at most, if you can come out alive. Medicia's eyes lit up. Can we leave earlier? Earlier? How much earlier? Now, immediately. She frowned slightly and said, I have to remind you that the trial of the planeswalker is very dangerous. You better be well prepared. Medicia turned around and looked at Hippamera. Both of them nodded at the same time. We have thought about it, Your Majesty Dragon King. For the past 3 days, the city of everlasting death was shrouded in shadows. Flames were burning in the city near and far. Golden smoke billowed into the sky, reflecting the night sky red. 3 days ago, the goddess of Waning Moon's scheme was thwarted, but she still left an indelible scar on the city. After the Temple of Waning Moon collapsed, a bottomless abyss replaced its original location. This abyss stretched across the center of the city. Countless children of the evil god were crawling out from the abyss. The necromancers had to do their best to suppress them in the center of the city. A believer of the Waning Moon walked through the hall and shouted to the balcony, Mr. Brando, your guest. Brendel and Delphine were talking on a balcony, and Andrea was standing by the side. This scene under the night sky was reflected in the eyes of the 3 of them. He turned around and saw a familiar figure appear in front of him. Brando. Freya was travel-worn. The tiredness on her face seemed to have been swept away. She had just dismounted from the back of the wyvern. Ever since she received the princess's order, she rushed here from Ranner without rest. Everything she saw and heard these days was like a dream. She could not believe the words of the Queen of Banshees, Yalvit, but the fact that the undead signed the peace agreement, withdrew from Erewhon, returned Butchie, and punished the war criminals was an ironclad fact. All of this was because of the man in front of her. It was rumored that he, together with the Nine Phoenix Alliance and the Silver Elves, defeated the undead empire in the south of the Sea of Waning Moon. Although the details were not detailed, the Black Rose of the Roman Empire had made concessions. If it wasn't for that heart-wrenching victory, the Emperor of Madara wouldn't have bowed down so easily. Others might not be able to do it, but she firmly believed that if it was that person, then he would definitely be able to do it. Because this was not the first time she witnessed him creating miracles. She still remembered the battle of life and death in Fortress Reden. If it was not for that life and death battle, if it was not for Brando, she would not be where she was today. The Valkyrie of Aween that was praised by the people. Freya remembered the light brown eyes that shone with unwavering hope. The chestnut-colored hair, the familiar face, appeared in front of her again. She smiled at her and said, "Freya? P.S. After organizing my thoughts, I'm back. I'll update one chapter today and I'll resume tomorrow." The main thing was that I spent some time thinking about Brando's Planeswalker cards. I definitely did not pick up trash or anything like that. Speaking of which, I've been really unlucky this month. I can't even drink water. Not only did I catch a cold some time ago, I even applied for a new bank card last week, but I forgot to tell my editor. As a result, I have to eat dirt this month. Chapter 1341. In the hall, a flight of 47 steps connected the balcony to the hall. A scarlet carpet was laid out from the top to the bottom. The portrait of the 17th High Priest of the Waning Moon Temple, the Eerie Edward, was hung on the walkway. He was thin and held a staff in one hand. Brando and Freya stood on the balcony, one in the hall, the other in the balcony. Their gazes passed through the length of the stairs and made eye contact. Freya took a deep breath. She seemed to have had a dream. This dream started from Butchie to Fortress Reden to Bragg's to the Royal Knight Academy to Ampere Seal to Randner to the battlefield of Manowar and then here. The scene in the dream changed until now. Brando, am I dreaming? I'm standing here, this is the capital of Madara. Did you really do it? Just as you promised us, Butchie has returned to Erewhon. The village has been rebuilt and everyone has returned to their homeland. We followed the path that we escaped from that day and returned to the embrace of the Pine Mountains. That nightmare of Madara, is it really over? Brando lowered his head to look at the young girl who had tied her light brown hair into a ponytail at the back of her head. Her long ponytail had been cut short after the Battle of Ampere Seal, leaving only the part that reached her shoulders. The shaved hair was placed on the snow-white tombs of the Holy City, together with the withered Erewhon lilies. Freya's eyes were brighter than they were in that era. She was more confident and determined, like a shining brown gemstone. Her pair of heroic eyebrows were raised high. There was no confusion, weakness, hesitation, or the deep fatigue that he remembered most deeply. She wore a well-tailored knight's uniform, a dark blue jacket and snow-white breeches. Her chest was pinned with the black pine medal and the candlelight medal. A vulture's tail drooped down from her shoulder, commemorating the glory of the Battle of Ampere Seal. It was a symbol of the veterans of the White Lion Legion. Erewhon's Valkyrie stood upright. Although she was travel-worn, her sword, belt, armor and accessories were all new and tidy. Only her boots were stained with some dust from the ashes of the city. When she got off her horse, she inevitably passed through a few streets that had turned into ashes. After 2 years of war and experience, the ignorant country girl seemed to have found the footprints in history and grew up. Two unrelated figures gradually overlapped at this moment and became one. You're not dreaming, Freya. The war is over. Although it was out of my expectations, those who deserve to be punished have all gone to hell. From now on, the war between Aween and the undead is a thing of the past. Brando sighed and replied. For this answer, Erewhon's people had sacrificed too much, and he had also sacrificed too much. Compared to the blood feud in his previous life, this ending was somewhat unexpected. He also never dreamed that he would one day sit together with his sworn enemy and discuss the future of the kingdom and the world. But sometimes, fate was just so bizarre. But how can that be in the past? Freya replied with some difficulty for a moment. She gripped her sword tightly. So many people died and all we got was a treaty. Madara should pay the price. In Erewhon's country, the nobles controlled by the royal faction also questioned the princess and the parliament. There she and the princess stood firmly on Brando's side, protecting his honor and authority. But here, as the most ordinary person in Erewhon, Freya could not help but ask this question. It was a hatred that had been rooted for hundreds of years, buried in the hearts of everyone who had been deeply hurt by it. At this moment she was not Erwin's Valkyrie, not the princess's knight, and not the commander of the White Lion Guards. She was just the girl who had escaped from Bucci. That night, the flames of Bucci burned fiercely, and her loved ones who had perished in the sea of fire. It was as if they were standing behind Freya. Then what do you want? Brando seemed to be able to feel the sorrow in Freya's heart. He said, Freya, if it's your wish, I'll fulfill all of your wishes. Even if it means destroying 2 countries and an entire world, I won't pay any price. Delphian stood behind Brando. She was about to say something, but when she heard this, she was so shocked that her expression changed. It was as if she had met Brando for the first time. She looked between the two of them. Andrea, on the other hand, looked at Freya with interest. The moment she saw Freya, she knew that this was the person she was looking for, the most important bloodline of the goddess of war's guards that was lost in the mortal world. Freya opened her mouth. What did she want? War? Revenge? No matter the cost, even if it meant dying together, she wanted Madara to pay the price? This was 100-year-old hatred that could only be washed away with blood and fire? Freya looked into Brando's eyes. She thought that Brando was warning her, but she realized from his unwavering eyes that Brando was serious. As long as she asked, he would definitely start a war for her. From then on, Madara and Erwin would fight to the death. What? Freya trembled deeply. She suddenly remembered many things. The 3 of them walked side by side in the darkness and defeated the golden demonic tree together. They fought their way out of a hopeless situation. Do you still remember the promise I made to you and the Roman in Bragg's, Freya? I remember. Brando's heart suddenly ached. Out of the 3 people who fought side by side in Fortress Reden, one of them was no longer by their side. Do you understand now, Freya? He shook his head and sighed. I once promised you and the Roman that I will fulfill your wishes. No matter how dangerous the road ahead is, no matter how much time has passed, this promise is still valid. Freya's heart was warm, but when she saw Brendel's gloomy expression, she could not help but feel a lump in her throat. Amandina and Seal had already told her everything that had happened in Rusta. No, we will definitely save Roman, right? Brendel's eyes were filled with tears. Of course. Brando nodded. He had no doubts about this. That's enough, Brando. I don't have any other requests, I just can't accept it. I can't accept it. After all, we have suffered so many disasters. We can't accept that the culprit who caused all these tragedies can easily shirk responsibility. Freya said in a small voice, I understand that Erwin gained a lot from this victory. But compared to what we have suffered, compared to the Romans' Black Rose, did the undead really learn their lesson? She raised her head and said loudly, I just don't want our forgiveness to become a reason for them to continue their evil deeds. Then what do you want, little girl? A voice suddenly spoke in the darkness. Everyone in the hall was shocked and raised their heads. Freya did not realize who was talking to her. She just replied subconsciously, if it's possible, I really want to see Her Majesty the Queen. You will see her. The voice said. Who's talking so sneakily over there? Freya finally reacted. She frowned and shouted at the darkness in that direction. I'm not sneaking around. In this land there is no need for me to be sneaky. The voice replied arrogantly. As it spoke, it walked out from the darkness. Because of my name, my power, I am the supreme master of this land. Queen Madara was dressed in a black evening dress. Beside her were 2 black knights. She walked out from the shadows and looked at everyone in the hall arrogantly. Who are you? Freya had already guessed the identity of the person who came, but she could not help but ask. As you can see, I am the person you want to see. Queen Madara replied coldly, now I am in front of you, the envoy of Erwin. Little girl, what do you want to ask? Freya pulled out her sword and pointed it at Queen Madara. The 2 black knights were shocked. They wanted to rush forward with their swords, but Queen Madara reached out to stop them. She still pointed the Lionheart sword at her snow-white neck. She raised her head and looked at Brando on the balcony, but Brando's expression did not change. He put one hand on the hilt of Oderfeis and only looked at the Black Knight behind her coldly. Queen Madara believed that if the 2 Black Knights behind her dared to pull out their swords, they would be reduced to ashes in the next moment. Queen Madara ignored the sharp edge of the sword and looked directly at Freya. What do you want, little girl? Freya did not say a word, but she suddenly sheathed the Lionheart sword and put it back into its scabbard. Queen Madara seemed to understand something. She snorted coldly and said, I see. It seems that you mean I am the culprit behind all of this? Your Majesty. The two black knights shouted in unison. But Queen Madara only waved her hand at them. She raised her head and said to Freya, "Yes, I am the instigator of the War of the Black Roses. The blood feud of Buchi should be counted on me. I will not repent for it." Freya looked at the queen coldly. Queen Madara looked back at her fearlessly. "I welcome you to put your sword in my chest at any time if you can do it. Of course you too, Mr. Count. The same goes for you." Her tone was arrogant as if she was still on her throne, and her tone was full of contempt for death. Queen Madara was standing in the hall, but she seemed to be looking down at everyone present, even Brando who was standing on the balcony. "However, in this war, I need you to stand with me. Madara, Erwin, and the 4 holy cathedrals. I need you to help me persuade the descendants of the 4 sages. I will kill you." Freya's eyes were full of hatred. "You will pay for everything you have done. But Erwin and Madara will also stand together," Brando said softly as if he was stating an established fact. His voice echoed in the hall like the ravings of a ghost. "We will do our best to persuade the 4 holy cathedrals to face this war that belongs to the whole of Wonde." Freya turned around and nodded silently. The queen chuckled. She also turned her back to everyone, waved her hand and did not say another word. She walked out of the hall with the 2 black knights. In the darkness, only the sound of footsteps could be heard. Chapter 1342. Does your Royal Highness have anything to say to me? Brando asked after Queen Madara left. Yes, there are 2 letters in total. One is from His Highness Haruz, and the other is from His Royal Highness. He entrusted Her Royal Highness to pass them to you. His Royal Highness? Brando thought for a moment, thinking that the Royal Highness should have made some moves in the north, unless he really didn't covet Erwin's throne at all. But judging from the way he arranged for his sister Kiara to be part of the envoy group, he was not an unambitious person. To be honest, he admired the first-in-line heir of House Cypher. Although he was born with a disability, he was wise, calm, patient, and knew when to advance and retreat. If House Cypher was orthodox, Brando even thought that the Royal Highness would be more suitable to inherit Erwin's throne because he was a man. After all, Erwin had no precedent of a female monarch, and Haruz's personality was too weak. Unfortunately, House Cypher lost its legitimate status in Erwin since it was abandoned by the Lionheart sword. Thinking of this, Brando couldn't help but glance at the Lionheart sword in Freya's hand. Is the letter here? It's on me. Freya opened her purse and took out 2 well-preserved letters. She stacked the 2 letters together and handed them over with both hands. Brando walked down the stairs and took the letter. As he was about to open it, Delphian's voice asked from behind him, "Do you need me to leave?" Brando looked back at her, thought for a moment and shook his head. "No, stay. If you stay, I might need your advice." He didn't intend to fully trust this woman, but although his alliance with Her Royal Highness and Haruz was not yet on the table, it was nothing compared to the other secrets they had experienced along the way. Delphian? It was only then that Freya noticed the Prime Minister's daughter on the balcony. She couldn't help but look surprised. Your lord saved my life. As repayment, I will serve Abes wholeheartedly." Delphian replied with a smile. "Brando, what's going on?" Freya raised her heroic eyebrows and spoke in an unfriendly tone. She placed one hand on the hilt of the Lionheart sword, as if she would unsheathe the sword at the slightest provocation. The Shire and Amandina had told her everything that happened in Rushta. She also knew how the Roman was captured by the tree herders and how the Twilight Dragon descended. It could be said that the Silver Queen and the tree herders were responsible for 1/3 of the disaster that happened that day, and the remaining 1/3 was this woman's responsibility. Freya and the Roman knew each other since childhood and grew up together in Buchi. It could be said that they were closer to each other than Brando. As the person who hurt the Roman, she didn't immediately draw her sword out of respect for Brando. Brando looked coldly at Delphian. This woman was playing her tricks again. Others might not understand, but he couldn't be any clearer. She was purposely angering Freya. He used his eyes to warn Freya not to cause any more trouble and told her everything that had happened from Rushta to the Sea of Elements to Rosaline. He also told her about his current relationship with the Prime Minister's daughter and the mystery of the Nature's Orb's whereabouts to the Valkyrie from Buchi. Freya listened to Brando's description and her expression softened. She didn't expect Brando to have experienced so much alone. She couldn't help but ask, "I didn't expect you to have experienced so much. Are you all right, Brando?" Brando shook his head. Freya thought for a moment. She wasn't the naive girl from before, so she quickly found a suspicious point. But Brando, when you wanted to kill her on the ship, why didn't you do it in the end? Did she tell you the secret of the jade of her own accord? Brando suddenly blushed as he recalled that ridiculous night. He quickly coughed and said vaguely, "Well, probably." Delphian looked at his awkward expression and snickered on the balcony. Probably? Well? Brando could only change the topic. Let's take a look at the letter first. I thought it would be the princess who wrote to me. I didn't expect it to be Haruz. What did the prince say in the letter? Freya shook her head honestly. I don't know either. This is a letter personally written to you by His Highness. How could I peek at it? That's right. Freya didn't know what Freya was thinking. She didn't know what Freya was thinking. Brando opened the envelope and shook out the letter from it. Haruz's envelope was sealed with his royal seal with the emblem of stars, moon, and lilies on it. It was the emblem of the royal family of Erewhon, but as the heir of the kingdom, his private emblem was slightly different from that of Griffin, with more ivy patterns. He opened the letter and glanced at it. There were only a few lines on the first page of the letter. The young prince first greeted him as a student, then briefly described the process of his return to Erewhon, the progress of learning black magic, and so on. The respectful wording and tone of the letter made him smile. Once again he thought of his shy and introverted student. What did Prince Haruz write in the letter? Freya asked curiously when she saw the smile on Brando's face. Obviously, this polite and shy young prince was also very popular in the AB's territory. It's nothing. He's just sending his regards. In the letter, he mentioned that Lady Freya is an excellent and noble knight, unlike his teacher. I'm sure you'll only know the contents of the letter after I open it. What does that mean? It means you won't peek. He asked me to say hello to you on his behalf. Brando, what did you teach Prince Haruz? How are you going to explain it to Her Royal Highness? Freya replied grumpily. Isn't that good? Only boys with a sense of humor can win the favor of women. Brando said as he opened the second page of the letter and continued reading. Oh, is that so? Freya deliberately glanced at Delphian, who was standing on the balcony. Although she couldn't get angry at Brando, it didn't mean she was an idiot. Brando immediately coughed loudly. I will tell the Roman. She held the sword, blushed, and gritted her teeth. Brando. The Prime Minister's daughter smiled but didn't say anything. But at this time, Brando raised his eyebrows and made a soft sound of surprise. He suddenly closed the letter with a very strange expression on his face. Freya noticed Brando's expression and stopped joking. She asked seriously, "What's wrong?" Haruz said he doesn't want to inherit Erewhon's throne. What? What? One after the other, Freya and Delphian on the balcony opened their mouths at the same time. However, the former's voice was pure surprise, while the Prime Minister's daughter seemed to have heard a strange story. Just like how a simple-minded person like a blank sheet of paper couldn't understand the ambitions of others, ambitious people often found it difficult to understand Haruz's desire to pursue freedom and plain life. In Delphian's mind, there was actually someone in this world who wasn't passionate about power and status? Then this person must be a fool. But Brando could barely understand the thoughts of his shy student. They were actually the same kind of people. If they weren't bound by responsibility, profit, power, and ambition weren't what they pursued. Haruz worked hard to become mature step by step, just to fulfill the expectations of Princess Griffin. And when he understood the responsibility he shouldered, perhaps the bond between the king and his subjects would be added. However, these were not what the young prince wanted. He was a little lost in thought and then said to the others present, Haruz said in the letter that he is not the person Erewhon needs. Erewhon needs a real hero, but that hero is not him. How can he be so willful? Freya was so surprised that she almost couldn't close her mouth. What about Her Royal Highness? Her Royal Highness didn't object. As the king of Erewhon, he has the right to pass the crown to the successor he entrusted, as long as this person has enough qualifications. Delphian suddenly said, for example, the successor of the royal blood or a prince. A prince? Delphian looked at Brando. If the seigneur marries Princess Griffin, he can be that prince. In Erewhon, no one is more qualified than him for this position. Freya opened her mouth in surprise and looked at Brando in disbelief. Indeed, Brando nodded, this is also one of Haruz's ideas. The other candidate is His Royal Highness, the eldest son of the king. If Haruz abdicates himself, House Cypher will have a legal position. But he looked at Freya and Delphian and changed the topic, we are not suitable. Freya had not yet reacted to this shocking news, only Delphian asked in confusion, why? Isn't this a good opportunity for us? My lord, if you want to save Erewhon you have to have it first. And as long as the Count becomes the master of Erewhon, you can use its power, and it will help us rescue the Roman lady, isn't it? Brando glanced at her as if he could see straight into her heart, but he shook his head and did not say anything. He just opened the second letter, the one sent to him by the eldest son of the king. To his surprise, this letter was in 2 copies, one of which was sent to him by Princess Chiara. Although he had always been biased against the northern nobles, he had always had a good impression of this little princess. After all, although Princess Chiara was a little capricious, she had saved his life. Without giving any promises at all, she had given him Cypher's heart, which was extremely important to the Cypher royal family. This kindness alone was not something he could ignore. However, Princess Chiara's letter did not mention anything about Cypher's heart. She only chatted with him about a bunch of interesting things she had encountered these days, and then told him that she could live in Abyss for a while as a magic apprentice. Coincidentally, her teacher was Amandina, who was recommended by Garlock. Of course, in Brando's view, this was not a coincidence at all. It must be the arrangement of the eldest son of the king. He could not help but shake his head, unable to figure out what the eldest son of the king was planning. Then he began to read the second letter. When he opened the letter sent to him by the eldest son of the king, Brando could not help but raise his eyebrows slightly, looking very surprised. In the letter, the eldest son of the king talked with him about the situation in the north of Erewhon. Overall, it was not too bad, but it was not too good either. Since the disaster of the fallen moon, a large number of refugees from Cruz had poured into the north of Erewhon through Anzaruta. Due to the abnormal weather after the arrival of the magic tide, the crops in the north of Erewhon failed, resulting in a large-scale famine. On the other hand, although the nobles in the north were bound by him to stand on the side of the Corvado royal family in the War of the Black Rose, with the end of the war and the onset of famine, the nobles in the north began to be less respectful than before the war. The nobles in the Grey Mountain and Balta had even threatened to take back Ampere Seal, so that they could survive the unbearable winter with the wealth of Ampere Seal. The eldest son of the king also mentioned in the letter that he and the princess should be careful of the royal faction, because according to the information sent back by his subordinates, some of the royal faction might be in contact with the nobles in the north. Although Brando was a little surprised that the eldest son of the king would remind him and the princess, what really surprised him was not this, but the last paragraph of the letter written by the eldest son of the king. Count Henry, thank you for fighting for the fate of Erewhon. You and I both know what the fate of this kingdom is. The dispute between Cypher and the Corvado royal family has been going on for 100 years, and now it seems that it has reached the final moment. It is like a carriage that is driving into the abyss. I and you in the south each hold the reins of the carriage. For a long time, we have carefully restrained this carriage so that it will not fall into the abyss of no return. But today, the moment the two families decide the winner, the north and the south will completely go in opposite directions. His Royal Highness is kind, but he does not see the blood and fire that this kingdom will face in the future. I believe that you must understand this. What Erewhon needs is not you and me, but a king who can bear the past grievances and history of the two families. And this lady is right beside you. I believe that with your sharp eyes, you must have already known her name. Your esteemed friend, Levin Ornessen Cypher. Brando held the page in his hand and was in a daze for a long time. His heart was like a stormy sea, and for the first time, he admired the first successor of the Cypher family. Perhaps in history, if he and not Queen Anna had stepped on the stage of history, Erewhon's history might have been different. Chapter 1343. The person mentioned in Levin's letter, Brando might have been puzzled before the trip to the elemental frontier, but now he knew very well that it was Amandina, the descendant of Baitiamaza's husband and the 2 children left behind by his ex-wife. She had the blood of the Cypher royal family, and at the same time stood firmly on the side of the traditional southern forces in Abyss, Ampere Seal, the dispute between the princess and the royal faction, and the subsequent Second War of the Black Roses. It could be said that she had the reputation of having both sides. Levin's letter said that she was a king who could carry the past grievances and history of the two families. Although Erewhon did not have the precedent of a queen, at this point, everyone could understand in their hearts that it was time for the ancient kingdom of Erewhon to change its traditions. Haruz was very good, but he was not suitable to be a king. Griffin and Levin each represented the forces of the south and north. As for Brando himself, first of all, he was not in the right position. He assisted Her Royal Highness Princess Griffin in governing Erewhon, and his identity was a glorious knight loyal to the orthodox bloodline of Corvado. It was because of this that he was able to gain the favor of the Highland Knight, Lantinilan, and Duke Vero. But if he took over the crown of Owain according to Haru's wishes, then he would be a despicable usurper, and his reputation and honor would disappear. Even the original alliance in the south would fall apart because of this. Perhaps Brando could care less about his reputation and honor, but he did not want to see the south return to the state before the Battle of Ampere Seal, which could be said to be a disaster for this ancient kingdom. Haruz was simple-minded and only considered the good side of things. Brando believed that the abdication mentioned in his letter was absolutely from his sincere thoughts. But Brando also knew that people's hearts were complicated, and the nobles would never look at this issue so simply. In fact, the rise of a powerful minister alone made the traditional noble forces uneasy. A series of actions by the royal faction, starting from his diplomatic mission to Cruz, showed that the nobles of Radnor and Griffin were trying to marginalize him and weaken his trust in Princess Griffin. Therefore, they would not tolerate him ascending the throne as a prince. As for Her Royal Highness, she might be more far-sighted than her brother, but she was also faced with a difficult choice. Should she choose to believe in Brendel? Should she choose to believe in someone who had even surpassed Duke Arek's power since the time of Arek? This was not an empty threat. Brando was the Lord of Tanajul, but in fact he controlled Radnor, Vlada Paz and most of the hilly areas in the south of Arek. He occupied almost 1/6 of Erwin's land, and at the same time, held the most powerful military force in this ancient kingdom. To put it simply, if Brando and his forces chose to stand by and watch in the Second War of the Black Rose, then Erwin would face even more desperate than in history. It was for this reason that Princess Griffin firmly stood on the side of the forces represented by Brando and Valhalla. Therefore, although Griffin knew the consequences of Haruz's choice, she still decisively supported her brother. On one hand, it was because Haruz was not suitable to be the king of Erwin, and on the other hand she handed the choice to him, wanting to see his true colors. Brando seemed to suddenly think of something. He suddenly folded Levin Ornesen-Cypher's letter, opened Haruz's letter, and turned directly to the last page. As expected, he found a silver lily ornament in the lower left corner. This ornament was exactly the same as the pattern on the brooch she gave him that day. It was the personal coat of arms belonging to Her Royal Highness. At the same time, it could also prove the authenticity of this letter. If Brando took this letter to Erwin's noble parliament, even if he could not win the support of the majority in the end, the Corvado royal family would lose its legitimacy because of this letter. Brando held these two letters and for a moment, he felt as if they weighed 1,000 pounds. These were two heavy trusts, one from the eldest son of the king in the north, and the other from Her Royal Highness the Princess. In the end, Princess Griffin handed the fate of the kingdom, her and her brother's fate, without reservation in his hands. Erwin's future might depend on his next idea. There was no doubt that the eldest son of the king in the north also deeply understood this, so he declined an opportunity in his letter. That might be the closest House Cypher had been to Erwin's throne since they lost the favor of the Lionheart sword. But for Erwin's future, he passed this letter to Brando through the hands of Her Royal Highness the Princess and Freya. Brando had never understood the eldest son of the king. There were very few descriptions of him in history. He only knew that this was a wise and ambitious man. He had lofty ideals and aspirations. Because of this, Brando had been carefully guarding against all the actions of the eldest son of the king for a long time. But today Brendel suddenly understood why he had such a dream, and what his ambition was. "Do you see, Her Royal Highness Senior and everyone?" Brando took a deep breath and suddenly felt a little dry in his eyes. "We are not fighting alone. In places where we can't see, there are many people standing side by side with us." He looked up, and in front of him was not the gloomy hall, but the hills of Tanajul, the rivers and plains of Ampere Seal. He saw shining flags and raised swords. The knights swore in unison, "May the black pine be evergreen, may Erwin live forever. May the ideals shine as before, may the swords shine as before." The fire of civilization was passed down in the dark wilderness, and Brando seemed to have received one of the torches. Under the trusting gaze of the two who held the torch was handed to him. He silently put away the two letters, and at that moment, he had made a decision in his heart. "Freya," he said. "What's wrong, Brando?" Freya did not quite understand why Brando suddenly became serious halfway through the letter. Could it be that there was some bad news in the letter? His Royal Highness is planning to make a move on the south? She thought about it in her heart. "Do you know why I asked you to come here?" Freya shook her head. "There are two main reasons," Brando replied. "The first is about the inheritance of your Valkyrie's mark. I know a lady who has a similar power to yours. She may know the origin of your power and teach you how to use it in battle. But about this, Miss Andrea will tell you about it in private later, so I won't go into detail here to avoid wasting time. Miss Andrea is? Brando turned his head and looked in the direction of the balcony. Andrea, who was standing next to Delphian, quickly waved her hand. In fact, Freya had already noticed this girl and quickly nodded to her. What's the second reason? Freya turned her head and asked. The second reason is the main reason why I asked you to come here. Freya's expression turned solemn when she heard this. The war between Erwin and Madara has come to an end, but it is not because we defeated the undead, but because the undead are facing another war with us. Brando told her about the war between Madara and the Crystal Cluster, the threat of the Dusk to Wound, and the plan of the Queen of Madara. Freya listened carefully to his statement and showed a thoughtful expression. Then she frowned and replied, speaking of which, those monsters. I have heard similar rumors in Erwin. What? Brando was shocked. The claws of the Dusk Dragon had already appeared in Erwin? Freya thought for a moment and replied, it has something to do with the people of Cruz. Since the disaster of the fallen moon, many refugees from Anzaruta have poured into the kingdom from the northern border. Some of the refugees mentioned the war in the north, and there were similar monsters in their words. The war in the north of Cruz. Brando finally understood. He remembered the words of the Queen of Madara and asked, are there any details about that war? No, it is said that the war took place in the north of the Sublime Inland Sea. Most of the refugees from Cruz and Erwin are from Anzaruta. There are only some one-sided rumors about that war. Freya shook her head and replied, do you still remember Breton? The White Lion Legion took in many refugees in the north. I also heard these things from them. Brando remembered this name. 2 years ago, Breton had caused trouble for him in Bucci. It was as if in the blink of an eye, there was a layer of estrangement between him and the past. Everything about the garrison seemed to have happened a long time ago. He asked about Captain Martin's situation. After learning that he had returned to Bucci and was still the captain of the garrison, he could not help but smile. Freya continued to talk about the war in the north. Overall, the situation did not seem too good. The Wind Elves had crossed the Golden Forest and approached the north of Erwin, as if they were guarding against something. But because the kingdom had just experienced a war, Her Highness had not had time to send out envoys. Brando thought of something and replied, well, at least the Wind Elves are nervous. Maybe this will make our plan easier. But Brando, Freya was not so optimistic. Regarding the alliance between Erwin and Madara, the opinions in the kingdom are not as unified as you think. Do you still remember the question I asked you before? In Manowar, Karsuk, Viro, and Grimoires, these war-torn regions, there are many who have the same opinion. The royal faction has used this opportunity to attack you in front of Her Highness more than once. They will not be happy to see your influence in the kingdom grow. Brendel sneered. He had already expected this. They're nothing but clowns. These short-sighted fools are nothing more than scabs. Then Brando, Freya saw that he was confident and did not try to dissuade him. In her mind there was nothing that Brando could not do. Ever since they had fought their way out of the encirclement of Fortress Reden, she had no doubts about this. What message do you want me to bring back to Her Highness? Chapter 1344. Brando was silent for a moment. Levin Onizen's intention of letting him elect Amandina to the throne was to give the nobles of the north and the south an opportunity to sit down and discuss the future of the kingdom. Because Amandina was the lost bloodline of the Cypher royal family, once Brando proposed this proposal, the first thing he had to do was to prove the legitimacy of her succession to the throne to the Parliament of Nobles. And as a branch of the Cypher royal family, the nobles of the north also had reason to participate and witness all of this. They might even be happy to see a descendant of the Cypher royal family take over Erwin's throne. In this way, the nobles of the north and south could end the long-lasting dispute between Erwin and Oberg VII through a parliament rather than a war. Levin Onizen knew the nature of politicians. Once they sat down and began to argue, the opportunity to resort to violence would almost disappear. But Brando did not intend to do so. He first repeated what the eldest prince wrote to them in the letter to Freya, and then said, although the eldest prince's method can temporarily avoid civil war and division, Erwin will return to the era when Oberg VII was still alive. The nobles are still like maggots eating away at the foundation of the kingdom. No matter how well we put on the surface, there is no guarantee that Erwin will be lucky every time. If this continues, it will collapse one day. Freya nodded. As someone who had always pursued the ideals of the princess and Brando, She could understand what the two of them wanted Erwin to be. It might be very far away, but it was definitely not the way it was now. She asked softly, "So Brando, what are you going to do?" "I have an idea." Brando thought for a moment and replied, "What Erwin needs is not the rules and orders set by a powerful person. I can protect the kingdom today, but I can't protect it every day. The kingdom's subjects have to choose their own path and destiny. This ancient kingdom used to have many kings. House Cypher and House Covardo have taken turns to rule it for nearly 1,000 years. Both families have deep prestige. Today, Princess Griffin and His Highness Levin are deeply righteous. In this case, why can't Erwin have two or more people who can decide its fate?" Freya was taken aback. Her eyes widened as she said, "Brando, you mean? Haruz has no intention of taking the throne. Then let Princess Griffin, His Highness Levin, and Amandina unite to form the Council of the Three Kings. Then new members will be elected from the current Parliament of Nobles to participate in this council. They will each represent the will of the three ancient families, the Cypher royal family, the Covardo royal family, and the local nobles. The royal family and the nobles will make a sacred oath to jointly control the fate of Erwin. They will protect each other. If any party violates this oath, then it will be despised by everyone. But is it really okay?" Freya asked in a daze. Brando's suggestion was somewhat beyond her imagination, but when she thought about it carefully, it did not seem impossible. Brando did not answer immediately. Whether this council system was good or bad, it might not be seen today. But first of all, it could end Erwin's long-standing crisis of conflict and division. More importantly, it could plant a seed in the hearts of the people so that they would get used to discussing the fate of the kingdom together, and not entrust the kingdom's future to a powerful lord or king. And one day this seed would take root and sprout in Erwin, and the kingdom would transition from noble politics to civilian politics. Only then would the late King Eric's dream be realized. Of course, Brando never thought of doing it overnight. At least for now, the nobles and the royal family of Erwin still needed a strong force. But this force could not be monopolized. It needed to be balanced, and the Council of the Three Kings or even the Council of the Four Kings was the best means of balancing. As long as Erwin could survive this disaster, the agreement between the nobles and the royal family would be deeply rooted in the hearts of the people. Freya lowered her head and thought for a moment before saying, "I'm afraid it won't be that easy, Brando. The royal faction will not agree. They have been in business for many years, and the royal family of Covardo finally took control of the south. They want to use the royal family to fulfill their ambitions, so how could they allow others to share the cake?" After becoming a qualified commander, Freya's knowledge had improved greatly, and she was able to point out the crux of the problem with a single glance. Brando shook his head in disdain. The royal faction's ambitions were once lofty, but most of them have changed. Because of the lack of a supervisor, apart from Oberway, Makarov and a few others, who still holds on to the late King Eric's dream. Those who are unscrupulous will eventually become greedy. Even I can't tolerate them, let alone the Council of the Three Kings. Then, Freya did not understand. No revolution is smooth sailing, Freya. Brendel silently folded up the letters from Haruz and the princess, and then handed it to the war goddess. "Take my message back and tell Princess Griffin, she will understand what to do." Countless people had already sacrificed their lives for Erwin, and now it was the turn of the nobles of the kingdom to be executed. As the descendants of the ancient nobles who led the people forward, they had to use their blood to prove their legitimacy. "This may be the last time I change Erwin's fate, and it must be the most thorough one," Brando continued as he handed the letter to Freya. "I left behind the reformed White Lion Legion Valhalla's fleet, and brought back the late King's Lionheart Sword and the White Lion Guards. Erwin will continue to expand southward in the future, and one day, it may become the hegemony of the Empire. I believe its fate has changed." "Brando?" Freya was shocked. "Are you leaving us?" Brando shook his head. "No, I'm not going anywhere, Freya. It's just that you have to understand that Valhalla's power can't affect Erwin all the time. Do you understand? What I want to build is not a puppet that relies on me but a kingdom with free will. If I take action today, I can even completely uproot Erwin's noble power, but it's meaningless because people will only remember the shadow under power at this moment, trembling under my rule. I can decide what I say and do, but I can't decide what everyone in this ruling class says and does. There will always be people who will use my name to run amok. It's not good for the kingdom. I'm not a qualified politician, but I know who is. I will appoint the three of them to pave the way for their future, and they will decide where Erwin will go in the future. I believe they will give this ancient kingdom a glorious future, just as they have personally handed over the power to decide their own fate to me. When Brando finished speaking, his words were like iron, as if they were powerful and resonating. Freya looked at him in shock. It was the first time she saw such a firm and confident expression from him. At this moment, Brando was like a true king, his every word and action determined the future of the kingdom. She took a deep breath and replied seriously, I understand. I will pass on your message to Her Royal Highness. Brando smiled and said gently, There's no need to be so serious, Freya, you've had a hard time on this journey. Rest for 2 days before setting off again, meet Miss Andrea, maybe you'll have some unexpected gains. Oh right, remember to tell the princess to be wary of the royal faction. I suspect that the All-for-One sect has infiltrated the royal faction very deeply, but I haven't had the time to deal with them yet. Freya was shocked, but she nodded. The two of them suddenly became silent. They had once fought side by side in Butchie's most dangerous situation, killing their way out of a hopeless situation. In the Sea of Fire in Fortress Reeden, thousands of undead, they relied on each other, waited for each other, and promised each other. The sprout of that promise had finally grown into a towering tree today. Brando. Freya suddenly spoke. Brando paused for a moment and raised his head. Seeing Freya's sparkling eyes looking at her, the Valkyrie's cheeks flushed red. Do you still remember our promise? She said word by word. Brando nodded. Brando, Freya mustered her courage and spoke slowly, You fulfilled your promise, you're a true man. I lost to the Roman, but that's not important. I like you, Brando, do you understand? Starting from Bragg's, the dream in my heart only exists for you. She seemed to have used all her strength to finish her sentence, then turned her head away, her chest was heaving up and down, the blood-red color extended from her cheeks to her neck. The hall was so quiet that even the sound of a pin dropping could be heard. Andrea's eyes were sparkling as if she was admiring her. Delphian smiled faintly, her eyes moving back and forth between the two of them. Freya, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said such rude words. Freya spoke softly, after saving the Roman, I will personally apologize to her, but I'm not the Valkyrie of Erewhon. Do you still remember Bragg's naive militia captain? I will always be by your side, Brando. Brando smiled bitterly. What else could he say? This was a sacrifice without any complaints, anything he said would only be pretentious. He just nodded silently and replied, Thank you, Freya. The Valkyrie of Erewhon was a little shy at this moment. On her heroic face, the pure and flawless smile was more precious than the wings of an angel. Freya pressed her hand on her chest. Her heart was beating so fast that it seemed like it was going to jump out. You scared me, Brando, she couldn't help but mutter to herself. Brando shook his head, thinking, Silly girl, silly girl. Chapter 1345. Have you made up your mind? Brando asked. Standing in front of him were Medisha and Hippamera. Both ladies nodded, but the silver elf princess looked determined, and the priestess looked somewhat ambiguous. As the shepherdess of Himalud, training was a journey, and in her opinion this was probably another interesting journey. I originally wanted you to return to Erewhon with Freya. Brando frowned. He had already learned from Fuchsia about the danger of this trial itself. In a sense, he was not willing to let Medisha and Hippamera take this risk. They could also grow up slowly by staying by his side, so why should he put all his eggs in one basket? My lord, we also had a lot of safer choices in the Battle of Abes and Ampere Seal. But you chose the most thorny path. You left behind such a courageous figure for us. How can you force us to stop in the face of danger? Medisa replied with a smile, as if she was recalling the stalwart figure at that time. Her eyes sparkled. But you chose the most thorny path. You left behind such a courageous figure for us. Brando was stunned. That's not the same, Medisha. Yes, because every time it was you who stood up to protect everyone, protect Sifrid, protect the villagers of Green Village, protect Her Royal Highness, protect Yuta and the rest. And this time it's our turn to contribute to you. As your followers, can you bear to see us unable to keep up with your pace? Yes, Hippamera also nodded. My lord, our path as planeswalkers has been determined for a long time, but because of various things, it has been delayed. My lord, your deck is so special. You gave us the power to be planeswalkers, and we have the responsibility to accept this trial for you. For the followers of Himalud, tempering is the only way to grow. Sir, please believe in me and Miss Medisha. My lord, Medisha added, Miss Hippamera is right. We don't have much time left. Whether it is to protect Erewhon or to save the Roman lady, we must become stronger. The Silver Elves had a proverb, Venitri Serilardo, which meant that if one did not welcome the gloomy storm above the sea, how could one witness the boundless sea and sky after the storm? Standing still in the face of danger is never the path to becoming a powerhouse. Before I became the commander of the Lingu army, I already understood the truth behind this sentence. She paused for a moment, her bright silver eyes dimming slightly. Of course, if you insist on having us stay, we can understand your intentions. We will still listen to your orders. Brando smiled helplessly as if he read a lot of things from those eyes that could speak. Seriousness, persistence, stubbornness, and a trace of attachment. He replied, "Well, I respect your choice. Medisha Hipamera, thank you. To be able to meet you, the Shire, Mephistopheles, Ropar, and everyone else, is perhaps the luckiest thing for me. Yes, each of us has our own path to walk. What you said is very reasonable, but we only have one life. Before making a choice we must be careful." "My lord," Medisha could not help but laugh, "before I met you, my title in the Silver Elf army was the Cautious Song of the Silver Moon. My lord, on the other hand, was often criticized by Miss Falerne for being careless and forgetful." Brando's face reddened. He was not interested in being the lord of the Abbes. It was inevitable that he would make all sorts of mistakes in his daily work. To Falerne, Amandina, and the Roman who often had to clean up his mess, other than the amiable Romaine, the other two could not help but complain. These daily matters were naturally not a secret to Medisha and Hipamera. However, he also understood that Medisha purposely brought up these embarrassing matters in order to ease the somewhat gloomy atmosphere, so that he would not be so worried. Although this little silver elf princess was not old, she was more understanding of people than many adults. When he first met this elven girl in the Valley of the Dead, it was precisely because of this selfless kindness that gave birth to the desire to protect her. Brando did not say a word. There were many things in his heart that he did not say out loud. In the somewhat dim environment, the little silver elf princess' eyes were bright, and a silent tacit understanding seemed to grow between the two of them. Only Hipamela seemed to be oblivious to this, as if she was a large third wheel. After all, Miss Priestess' heart was pure, her heart was pure, and her heart was only filled with reverence and belief for Lady Himelud. She did not have as many complicated thoughts as these two. After a long time, Brando coughed lightly, and deliberately asked a little awkwardly, "The Cautious Song of Silvermoon?" Medisha blushed. This was probably the only time she had boasted since she was born. "It's just a title that's not so famous. In the War of the Holy Saints, many people received titles. After all, it was an unprecedented battle, and the later generations were full of reverence for war. That is why there are so many strange titles passed down. Not everyone is worthy of their name." Not so famous a title? Brando thought to himself that he would be seeing a ghost if he really believed it. He had long seen that in the field of serious nonsense, compared to her sister Medisha, this younger sister was not to be outdone. Could it be that this was the family tradition of the Silver Elf royal family? However, Medisha and Hipamera's choice reminded him that the path of a planeswalker was indeed a shortcut for him to obtain power. Fuchsia had once reminded him that in his deck, other than the Knight of Felon Medisha, only he could control the land cards and artifacts that could produce wealth. The colored mana produced by the land cards and artifacts was an indispensable resource for a planeswalker. Now that Medisha and Hipamera had embarked on the path of perfecting the rules of the planeswalker, then as the planeswalker who controlled this deck, he must consciously fill in the last flaw of this deck. In Farnazane's Winter Solstice Palace, the resounding sounds of argument shook the holy hall that had gone through two eras and witnessed the countless ups and downs of the Holy Church and the Empire's history. In the center of the hall, Petyen III sat on the throne and looked at his courtiers with a cold expression. In the year of the Golden Flame, there was once a great painter who painted a masterpiece that was handed down from generation to generation: The Disputing Court. Although that painting depicted the rise and fall of the Kurlutz dynasty during the Norris era, it was so similar to the scene in front of them. Or rather, wherever there were humans, there would be no shortage of interests and struggles for power. The courtiers and even the bishops, who were dressed in dark red, plain white or dark blue robes with golden edges, were divided into several camps. They were criticizing and attacking each other, and some of them were even flushed with anger. They did not have the image of a gentle aristocrat at all. Most of the words they said were words such as oppose, disagree, absurd, and impossible. It was a meaningless and unconstructive situation. This situation had been going on for several hours. If it was a normal day, Petyen III would have thrown out those who dared to create chaos out of his palace, but today was a little special. After a moment, he straightened up from the holy throne, raised his hand and asked everyone to quiet down. The hall, which was as lively as a market in Saipan, the largest trading port in Fanzan, was suddenly so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. The courtiers, who were dressed in different colors, looked at each other and returned to their positions. The hall of the Winter Solstice Palace was like an oval. The highest position in the north was the sacred throne of Fanzan, which was the apex of secular and divine power. However, from the sides of the throne down to the southernmost side, everyone had a seat and the seats were equal. It implied that everyone was equal under the divine power. Petyan III looked a little tired because the dispute had been going on for a whole day. In fact, he had already come to a conclusion on this topic, but he had to give his courtiers an explanation. "Well, I've made up my mind," Petyan's low voice slowly sounded in the hall. "I asked you to come here not to see you come to a conclusion, but to answer your questions. Of course, God has given us the right to think, but thinking is a process of judging things wisely, not for calculating a little gain or loss. As my courtiers, servants of God, I hope you can look further." After he finished speaking, His Holiness the Pope glanced around the oval hall with a deep gaze. Under his gaze, Archbishop Karagisti stood up. "Your Majesty, we can understand what you mean, but Cruz is our opponent. Right now they are in a civil war. We can choose to stand by and watch, or we can choose to hit them when they are down. However, if we intervene at this time, regardless of whether His Royal Highness can really win, isn't it a little too rash?" "I don't see it that way." Another courtier stood up. "Everyone understands the concept of adding flowers to a brocade, but providing help in a time of need is the most precious. We've invested in it in advance so we don't have to pay much, but if we can weaken our archenemy, it's a profitable business for Farnazane." "He, the Minister of Commerce, is indeed a businessman. You keep talking about business, but how can there be a profitable business in this world? Rodier told us in his book, The Nation, that there are only benefits and betrayals between countries. The Royal Highness of Cruz is first and foremost a citizen of Cruz. Even if he really wins the throne, he will still be the Emperor of Cruz. These two identities make it impossible for him to think from the perspective of the people of Anir. Even if we sign various treaties with him, he can turn his back on us. The key is, as two feuding countries, we lack the necessary means to restrain him. Under this premise, I don't think this so-called business will work." Chapter 1346. There's also the war in the east. Although Fanzan has always been on good terms with the wild elves of Iranta, isn't it too rash to remove the barrier in the east of the kingdom and send the army to the Great Glacier just because of a prophecy? The situation in the 10 cities has also begun to deteriorate. The barbarians have invaded Golden Anchor Harbor from the north. The two dukes of the Tenor and Harjard families have expressed concern about the military situation in the north. The trade union wants to expand the strength of the mercenary corps, but this proposal has been put on hold until today. For a moment, the buzzing in the hall rose again. Although the courtiers did not stand up to argue this time, the private discussions fell into Pedian's eyes. This made the supreme person of the empire frown. He looked at Bishop Shargusti, who was the first to stand up, and replied, "It was His Excellency Asabanto's idea to send the Order of the Silver Horse south to support the people of Cruz." This sentence was like a spell that made the entire hall quiet down in an instant. This sudden silence was even weirder than before. It was as if a cold north wind whistled through the palace, freezing everyone's breathing. As everyone knew, Pedian III was the current pope. In Fanzan, the pope held both the divine and royal power of the empire. It could be said that he was the most supreme figure. But before he ascended to the throne and was crowned, his teacher, Asabantu XI, was even more famous. Even though he was already a dignified pope today in front of the previous pope, he was just a child who had just started to wield the scepter. Asabanto XI was the pope who had experienced the Holy War. Most of the politicians and emperors of his generation, including the famous Emperor of Cruz, had already died. As a king who walked out of blood and fire, this pope had enough reason to make anyone tremble in fear. It would be the same even if he added the word Qian in front of his title. Pedian III seemed to have expected the reaction of his courtiers, so he added, "Moreover, the Order of the Silver Horse is not going to support or rescue the eldest son of Cruz, but to support the people of Cruz." Support the people of Cruz? The courtiers looked at each other, wondering if this was a high-sounding excuse to intervene in the internal affairs of the people of Cruz. Pedian III stood up from his throne. His tall and burly figure made everyone present feel a little breathless. He looked at everyone present and said, The War of Cruz is far more complicated than you think. My courtiers, this war concerns all of us. The Order of the Silver Horses movement is just the beginning. I have to explain this to you because next, I need all of you to unite with me and faces with me. As he spoke, his face darkened. Be it for the Empire or the Holy Church, the coming days will be the most difficult. I hope that you can let go of your hatred and pick up the sacred oath from 1,000 years ago. If anyone is unwilling to do so or even tries to obstruct us, then what awaits you won't just be my anger. Pedion III's voice echoed in the hall, and the chilling intent contained in it made everyone shudder. The courtiers could not help but look at each other for a moment. Your Majesty. Bishop Sheragust was stunned for a moment before he asked, "Are you sure about all this?" Pedion III nodded. "This is an oracle." In an instant, there was a great uproar in the Winter Solstice Palace. In the dark mountains to the west of Mehodafen, bonfires were rising like stars. Looking into the distance, with the help of the faint light of the golden moon, one could see that there were still winding troops on the plains entering the mountains. Since the defeat in East Metz, the remnants of Cruz's army fled from Fathom Port and the north of Ludwig. Some of them went south into the Evergreen Corridor, and some passed through the Mehodafen Basin and went west into the mountains. After the Crystal Army swept through the whole of Metz, they did not pursue further. This gave the Black Legion and the allied forces of the local nobles of Metz a chance to catch their breath. However, the good times did not last long. According to the reports of the scouts who came down from the front line, it seemed that after a short pause, the Crystal Army showed signs of continuing to move east. Kacha, Kacha. The knight's heavy footsteps could not draw Veronica's attention away from the military map spread on her legs. The light from the bonfire shone on the face of the former commander of Cruz's army. Her eyes were shining. There were many people patrolling back and forth around her, but among the messy footsteps, one was particularly clear. It stopped in front of her. "Teacher, the scouts have sent back information. Those terrifying monsters have passed through Fathom Port. It is not clear if they have gone south, but at least some of them are heading towards Mehodafen." A somewhat tired voice sounded. It was only then that Veronica lifted her head, her eyes reflecting Vahina's figure. This student of hers had always given her a headache in the past. Even though Vahina was very talented and had great comprehension in both magic and swordsmanship, her bad temper was truly unflattering. Veronica knew very well that her student was known as a demoness in the imperial capital. However, at this moment, the arrogance and willfulness of the past could not be found on the face of the little princess of Flowerleaf Ridge. Instead, it was replaced by maturity and determination. Vahina was wearing a knight's armor that was rarely seen on her. A sword was hanging on her waist. Her fair face was covered with a layer of dust, and there were a few scratches on her forehead. However, the biggest change was the look in her eyes. Her pale blue eyes were like the sea. At this moment, there was a calm and steady light in her eyes. Sometimes, Veronica could not help but think that if this nightmare did not happen, she would be relieved to see her student again. Unfortunately, hypotheses were only hypotheses. The war in East Metz had become the biggest nightmare for everyone who had experienced it. Even for Veronica, who had experienced the Holy War 60 years ago, it was the same. Sometimes she would compare her experience in the Holy War with what she had been through these days. However, every time she could not help but think of the scene where Cruz's army collapsed under the impact of the Crystal Cluster C. In that battle, Cruz's army witnessed the suffocating dragons falling one after another in front of their eyes. Then they were defeated and lost all memories of the battle. However, Cruz's army was defeated, but they did not die. The dead had fallen into eternal slumber, but the living still had to struggle for survival and hope. Veronica only nodded silently at Vahina's words. She frowned and drew a line on the military map with a charcoal pencil. It marked the latest movement of the Crystal Cluster C. It could be seen that at least in the Bankdale region and the entire Metz region, the Crystal Cluster C's army was unstoppable. Although they had not yet moved south, the south of the Evergreen Corridor had just experienced the devastation of Georgandy Ridge and Toquinen. The Empire's only strength was the Red Legion that was still in the wilderness of the Four Territories. It was not that she did not think of going south to join the Red Legion, but the journey was too far. More importantly, the noble army in East Metz had lost their morale. If it was not for the fact that the Empire's enemy would not give them a chance to surrender, these people would have collapsed long ago. She could bring the remnants of the Black Legion and the Azure Legion to the south, but the Empire's strength was so weak that these noble legions could not be abandoned. As for the Cloak Bay region and Anzaruta, there was still no contact. Although Veronica did not know that the disaster of the fallen moon had torn apart the southern part of the sublime inland sea and permanently changed the terrain there, she thought that those places would not be spared. If the Crystal Cluster C's army could move west from the Bankdale region, they could naturally go south as well. Although the Cloak Bay region still had the Empire's navy, it would be difficult for them to resist those terrible monsters. In other words, the remaining strength in her hands and the Red Legion in the wilderness of the Four Territories might be the only strength left of the Empire. When did the kingdom left behind by the Flame King Gretel, one of the most powerful empires in the human world, fall to such a state? Lenoret, who was sitting next to Veronica, looked a little gloomy. However, the eldest son of the Emperor quickly calmed down, and the depression on his body was swept away. He turned around and asked, "What should we do now, Lady Veronica?" Vahina also stared at her teacher. Veronica frowned slightly. The Crystal Cluster C's army had already overflowed Fathan Port. It was no longer possible to turn back and go south through the Evergreen Corridor. There were only two paths in front of them. One was to go north into Fanzan and ask for help from the Templar. However, the people of Vanir were the enemies of the Cruz people. The hatred between the two was even deeper than the conflict between the Cruz people and the Wind Elves. Moreover, they had to go north through the most dangerous part of the Alkash Mountains, which was close to the Great Glacier region. It was difficult for the army to pass through. In comparison, both Vahina and Lenoret were willing to choose the second path, which was to go to the southern foot of the Alkash Mountains. The low hills there were much easier to walk on than the steep ridges and mountain paths at the edge of the Great Glacier. After passing through the Golden Forest, they could enter the wilderness of the Four Territories. There might be a chance to meet up with the Red Legion. However, they would have to face the possible pursuit of the Crystal Cluster C's army. When they thought of the defeat in East Metz and the terrible enemy they would have to face, even the most courageous knight of Cruz had to remain silent. While they were hesitating, there was a sudden commotion in the crowd. Veronica was just thinking about what the little count from Erwin would do in such a situation. At this time, she looked up and saw a group of people had separated the crowd and came to the bonfire. Buga people? Vahina, who was standing at the side, was slightly stunned. Chapter 1347. A sharp whistle echoed in the dense forest, followed by a series of heavy footsteps that swept past like a gust of wind. The ground trembled, accompanied by the sound of metal clashing. "Look over there. The vanguard of the monsters is catching up. Stop them, don't let them catch up to Lady Veronica," the knight shouted, led by Vahina, who was dressed in military attire. She looked towards the intersection between the hills and valleys, and there was indeed a group of creatures covered in dark crystalline carapaces at the intersection of the mountains in the distance. They were the most common type of monsters, with strength in the upper silver tier. They were very fast, only slightly slower than the light cavalry of the Empire. More importantly, they often acted as the vanguard of the monster army. Once they were entangled, the main force of the monsters behind would come in an endless stream, and everyone would be killed here. From West Metz to Mehodafen in the past half a month, countless battles with these monsters. Although they lost more than they won, those who survived had gradually learned the ins and outs of these enemies. Although Cruz's people did not have the courage to fight a decisive battle with this terrifying army, but a small team battle was not a problem. Not to mention that there were the elite knight of the Empire, the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. As long as we don't get entangled by them, it'll be fine. Vahina had a plan in her mind. She raised her sword, clamped her dragon's belly, and led the charge towards the vanguard of the Crystal Cluster. "Knight, follow me." The noblewoman's lead ignited the pride in the hearts of the knight, and they shouted in unison, "Kill!" Then they poured down. Vahina and her dragon were the first to charge into the formation of the Crystal Cluster. The runic circle on her armor lit up first, and then it was white magic missiles, followed by blazing thorns. The white beams shot into the Crystal Cluster like flying needles, and the Crystal Cluster fell one after another. The next Crystal Cluster that pounced on Vahina's warhorse crashed into the burning thorns that grew around it, and immediately exploded into pieces. Vahina took the opportunity to cut down one of the sturdier Crystal Clusters, before raising her left hand in another direction. The magic circle on her gauntlet glowed faintly, and a fireball flew towards the dense swarm of monsters. The raging flames exploded in the darkness and formed a bright golden ball, and the knight saw countless crystal clusters being sent flying into the air. The knight exclaimed. Vahina's magical talent and swordsmanship were perfectly integrated at this moment. If Brando was here, he would be amazed at the growth of the noblewoman's combat skills. the front of the crystal cluster opened up in an instant, and the knight at the back immediately swarmed in, continuing to expand their advantage. Such a scene was often seen in the Battle of East Metz, but Cruz's advantage often did not last long. The crystal cluster could use their advantage in numbers to make up for their disadvantage in quality. Even if the folded sword knights were far superior to them in terms of individual combat strength and mutual understanding, the crystal cluster was not inferior in terms of high-end strength. Vahina knew that they had to run in order to display the combat strength of the folded sword knights. She did her best to move forward and cut down every monster in front of her with her sword. Fortunately, this was not the main force of the crystal cluster army, and there was no sea of monsters, so the advantage in quality quickly took over the situation. Suddenly, there was an empty space in front of her, and only then did Vahina realize that they had successfully turned around. Victory was in sight, and she just needed to put in a little more effort. Run, run! Vahina shouted loudly with a heavy panting sound in her voice. The continuous battles after night had exhausted her. This was the strategy of the crystal cluster army. The monsters were stiff and rigid in battle as if they had no brains, but there was a brilliant will behind them that commanded them. The many battles from East Metz to here had already proven this point. But the knight at the back could no longer run. They were already exhausted. Vahina watched as the monsters pounced on the back of the earth dragons, and pulled the young knight down from the saddle. Her heart sank. She bit her lower lip tightly, and for some reason she suddenly thought of another face in her heart. Am I going to die here, country bumpkin, that bad guy? The knight of the folded sword finally started to run, and pulled away from the crystal cluster army that was chasing behind. Vahina was looking for an opportunity to turn around and kill the enemy when a few bright flashes of light suddenly lit up in the darkness in front of them. 1, 2, 3 flashes of fire passed over the heads of the knight, leaving a golden-red afterimage in their sight. They turned around just in time to see a cluster of flames exploding in the group of monsters in that direction. The ground shook and a heatwave surged. This time there was no need for Vahina's order. The knight automatically turned around and charged back into the enemy's formation. The crystal cluster army that had been severely injured could no longer resist. After 3 rounds of charging back and forth, there was no longer a single monster standing on the ground in the valley. Layers upon layers of crystal cluster corpses covered the valley. The knights stopped and got down from their mounts to rest. Some of them fell to the ground as soon as they got down from the earth dragon's saddles, as if they no longer had the strength to stand up. However, there were also some who were rummaging through the corpses of the crystal cluster. Some of the crystal cluster bodies would be accompanied by magic crystals, which was an important means for mages to restore their mental strength at this moment. The night wind blew down from the ridge, blowing away the embers and smoke on the battlefield. The tattered flag of the knight of the folded sword fluttered in the wind. Vahina also jumped down from her mount and leaned on the earth dragon's sturdy right hind limb to rest. She opened the canteen and saw a few mages in silver robes waving at them in the dark on the distant hills, signaling them to hurry up. They were the Buga's gray-robed apprentices. Vahina's chaotic mind recalled what happened earlier. Although she did not know which Bugas had used strategic spells to support them and the dragon on the battlefield in East Metz, she did not expect the leader of the Arcane Realms Enforcers, Lone, to personally come here to meet them. He was one of the 12 leaders of the Silver Alliance's wizards, a legendary figure. It was said that he was injured in Erewhon some time ago, but it seemed that he had almost recovered. Vahina could not think of what kind of situation could injure such a terrifying existence. The first thing she thought of was whether it had something to do with that bastard. But this time the young lady was right. Lone was injured by Sheeta's Tsar bomb during his adventure in the deadly tundra with Brando, but he was strong enough to heal his old injuries in just a few months. There was also a golden dragon accompanying Lone. Vahina recognized the mature blonde lady in human form called Aksharopia. She fought side by side with Cruz in East Metz, and was one of the few dragons who escaped that day. The Buga somehow convinced Veronica and the eldest prince to choose to go through the southern foot of the Alkash Mountains, through the Alcala area, and enter the wilderness of 4 territories. But this way, it was inevitable to encounter the Crystal Cluster army. The consecutive encounters throughout the night were extremely difficult, and the remaining morale of Cruz's people was almost exhausted. It was because of this that the dukes did not dare to let the nobles' private army walk behind, lest they collapse when they were pursued by the Crystal Cluster army. As a result, the Black Legion and the Folded Sword Knight had to stay behind to cover the rear. Fortunately, the Bugas came to their aid or the battle would have been over. Vahina took a deep breath. The cold air seeped into her lungs and stimulated her to the point where she almost coughed out blood. She glanced into the distance, and a silhouette flashed out from the group of gray-robed Buga mages, and quickly ran towards her direction. The silhouette lifted his robe, and ran from afar until he was right in front of her, and then threw himself into her arms. "Sister." "Elise," Vahina said sternly. "Why are you here?" "Sister, I want to help you," Elise raised her hands. "You see, sister, I'm also a mage and even the Bugas praised me for my talent in spell casting." "Nonsense, you should stay by teacher's side, that's where you should be." The little girl did not expect Vahina's reaction to be so intense, and her eyes were immediately covered with a thin layer of mist. "Sister, I'm worried about you, father and brother. How can I stay behind alone?" Vahina's heart softened. There was a time when she was not like that. She recalled her encounter with that bastard in the loop of trade winds. At that time she did not think she was unruly at all, and only thought that the hateful country bumpkin was so annoying. But now that she thought about it, those were such warm memories. She reached out and ruffled her sister's blonde hair. Her brother and father were on the other side of the battlefield, and Mehotafen's entire strength was invested in this battle that would determine the survival of the empire. It was all for the sake of protecting those they wanted to protect. "Elise, listen to me, I'm not in any danger here, but you can't distract me, okay?" "Really, sister?" "Of course, I'm teacher Veronica's proudest disciple, and a genius of the empire. How could anything happen to me here? You can ask them if you don't believe me." She turned her gaze to the Folded Sword Knight. Although she was not a member of the Folded Sword Knight, most of them were trained by the Green Sword Saint. The young men smiled awkwardly, and did not comment on Vahina's boasting. Vahina could only sigh in the face of these lazy fellows. In fact, she was indeed lying. The army had just entered the outskirts of Alcala, and in history the Empire once fought a great battle with the Wind Elves and Fanzan. The terrain here was open, and it was very convenient for the Crystal Cluster army to pursue. At least until they passed through Mount Ordos they would only be safe. Before that, there were at least a few tough battles to fight, and no one could say for sure who would last until the end. Chapter 1348. The biting cold wind howled angrily, like an angry beast howling in the mountains. Veronica and the accompanying knight braved the razor-sharp icy wind and walked up a hill. Their vision crossed the steep mountains that seemed to have been carved by a knife and an axe. The mountains were silent in the night, and only a vague outline could be seen. This side was as smooth as a mirror, shining under the golden sea moon, exuding a pale color. And at the foot of the mountain, a dark mass of creatures was gathering like a stream of water, forming a dark mass of about 10,000. There were also some flying creatures in the sky. These monsters were guarding the Ordos Pass, blocking the road to Alcala. From time to time, the howls of the monsters came from far away with the wind. In this dark night, it was even more frightening. These monsters are indeed slowing us down while circling to the front to block us. The Ordos Pass is the only mountain path in the vicinity that can lead to the Alcala area. Otherwise, we can only take a detour further north. But the main force of these monsters is already behind us, and there is not much time left for us to make a choice. The one who spoke was Lorena, the daughter of the Grand Commander of the Knights Templar. She and her fiancé, Filas, were part of the Empire's entourage to explore the deadly frost forest with Brando. After the big explosion, she and Filas returned to the country together. Not long after, they were imprisoned by the Silver Queen and Veronica. Later they were rescued by Brando. After the upheaval in Rushta, she, Veronica, Vala, and others were teleported away from Bankel and came to East Metz to experience the fiasco. And due to the shortage of lower-level officers after the fiasco, not only was Vahina also appointed as the captain of the Folded Sword Knights, but the former number 1 knight genius of the imperial capital was directly appointed as a deputy by Veronica. Now she was a member of the middle-level commanders of the Azure Legion. Miss Knight was dressed in military attire, and her fiancé, Filas, was standing beside her. As almost all members of Prince Barano's family had perished in this upheaval, the only eldest heir looked a little depressed at the moment, not as cheerful as when he was in Erewhon. The dragons are still buying time for us, but there is no doubt that it is only a matter of time before those flying crystals arrive. There is no time for us to take a detour to the north. If we encounter those monsters at the Alcash Mountain Pass, we will all be wiped out. Luowen, who was wearing a silver robe, replied. The strong wind caused his robe to flutter, but he held an ivory staff in his hand and stood in the cold wind. His performance was even more calm than the night, as if he was not affected in the slightest. He looked at Vala of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, who was silent, and continued, "Your Excellency, the best way now is for us to join forces and defeat this army. Before the Crystal Cluster army arrives, we can open a path from the front. What do you think?" Before Vala could speak, Sydney, who was beside him, had already nodded, "Yes. Then the coordination of the army will be handed over to Lady Veronica," Luoan said. "Legion Commander, is that okay?" Veronica stared at the dark mass of the Crystal Cluster army below and nodded, "I will coordinate with Mangrove." She looked at the eldest prince, Lenoret, who also nodded silently. Everyone present understood that the next battle would be the key to determining the outcome of this night's war. No matter how well they had done before, if this battle was lost, then the future of the Empire would be gone. For the people of Cruz, it seemed that since the tragic battle on the Great Plains, the descendants of the Flame King, Gretel, had ushered in another war that they could not afford to lose. Almost everyone present in Cruz prayed silently in their hearts, praying that the sages who had fallen into eternal slumber would bless their descendants and allow them to seize the last glimmer of hope. Blow the horn. The heavy cavalry of the Azure Legion began to gather on the side of the battlefield, and Veronica waited for a moment before speaking. On the hill, rows of mages in silver robes began to flicker, and then disappeared one by one. Finally, the leader of the Hidden Realms Enforcers, Luoan, and the Great Holy See of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, High Priest Vala, who brought iron and fire, both stepped into a light door without saying a word. Sydney, the adoratress of the Leo Palace, looked back at the female Legion commander before stepping into the light door that belonged to her. Veronica took a deep breath, and there seemed to be many images of the battlefield in front of her. Sometimes it was the Valley of Hagen, where the Lion army surged like a tide, or the Battle of Watercress Castle, where the enemy this time was replaced by the Wind Elves, the Night, the Forest of Spears, the arrows that seemed to overshadow the sky, and the images of the enemy alternated. The Fanzin, the Elves, the Mountain Folk, the Lion Men, and sometimes even the Heavy Knight of Cruz. Every battle she had experienced appeared in front of her eyes. Until finally they overlapped into one and turned into the scene in front of her again. In the mountains of Alcra, the cold wind whistled, and the Crystal Legion's army was waiting for the first attack of Cruz's people. The sound of the bugle horn echoed throughout the mountains and plains. Brando had a dream. In the dream he seemed to have returned to the past in the game. The biting cold wind of the mountains, the dark sky, the wailing of the wind, and the endless, despairing army. They covered the sky and covered the earth, surging like a tide. The resistance of the humans was so weak and powerless. They roared, fought, and used every ounce of their strength, but the enemy came from all directions and there was no chance at all. His heart was burning with anger. Where was the Diamond Force? Where was the Thorny Flower Fire? Where was the army of the Holy Church? Where were the reinforcements? He remembered that the last thing he saw was the skeleton of a WRM that was shrouded in a dark aura. It whistled through the air and grayish-white flames spurted out of the WRM's mouth, turning everything in its path into ashes. Then the entire world dimmed, plunging into darkness. Then he woke up. That battle was the last memory he had of that world. He didn't know what happened after that battle in the Alcash Mountains, but the defeat of the army of Fanzin and Cruz would definitely bring about earth-shaking changes in the game. In a sense, it was a battle that changed the history of Wond. But in this world there might not be such a battle anymore. Brando didn't know that at this moment, there was a battle that would decide the fate of an empire, and it was happening in the same place. Many familiar names and familiar people were fighting for their lives in this battle. He didn't know that maybe in the time he opened his eyes, those familiar names had already passed away and turned into memories of the past. He woke up from the darkness, feeling a little strangely frustrated. He put on his coat and went outside. There was a long corridor outside the door and it was silent. He followed the memory of the day through the dark corridor, and there was a light in front of him, and he was already in a courtyard. The cool night wind blew on his face. He had just taken a breath when he heard a puzzled voice. "Brando?" Brando was slightly stunned. He knew that there was only one person here who would call him that. He looked up and saw Freya's lonely figure standing in the courtyard, looking at him with a surprised expression. "You can't sleep either, Brando?" Brando wanted to say that he suddenly woke up, but for some reason he just nodded silently. "What about you?" "I'm going back to Erwin tomorrow, Brando," Freya said softly. Brando suddenly understood what Freya wanted to say. The moonlight in the land of eternal death shone on the courtyard, and it was a faint silver color. "Walk with me?" he suddenly asked. Freya was stunned and then nodded. She was resolute on the battlefield, but in front of Brando she had always been submissive. The two of them walked along the courtyard's corridors silently, and only the rustling of their footsteps could be heard. The girl lowered her head and felt the thumping of her heart, which was strong and rhythmic. "What did Andrea tell you about your background?" Brando suddenly asked. Andrea had vaguely revealed to him that Freya's bloodline and inheritance might be related to the goddess of war. He only knew that Freya's real name was actually Alicia Everton. She was the daughter of the Earth Knight Everton. In order to escape the purge of the royal faction during the reign of Oberg VI, she was brought to Bucci by the royal faction and arranged to live with her uncle and aunt. The Earth Knight Everton did not have any special inheritance, and was just an outstanding knight. Freya's inheritance and bloodline of the Valkyrie could only come from her mother. Princess Griffin had once talked to him about this matter, but Freya's mother had always been a mystery. Everton once had a spouse, but both of them died in the war. That lady was not from Erwin's noble family, and this was very rare, and there was no way to investigate. Brando knew that ever since the disaster in Bucci, Freya had been very concerned about her background, especially after she found out the true identity of her father. So when Andrea mentioned this matter, he insisted that Freya go to the land of eternal death. If it was only for the sake of the alliance with Madara, Amandina was actually more suitable than her to be Erwin's envoy. As expected, after hearing Brando's words, Freya's eyes flashed and she replied, "Miss Andrea thinks that I might be a descendant of one of their lost clansmen in Wonde." Chapter 1349. A branch of the clan that was lost in Erwin? Brando was puzzled. Isn't the goddess of war a kind of inheritance? Is this inheritance also related to bloodline? Freya shook her head and turned around. She pointed at the shining mark of the goddess of war on her forehead and said, "Andrea told me that the inheritance of the goddess of war is because of this. She said that this mark contains the vast knowledge and memories of the goddess of war passed down from generation to generation. It can be transferred or passed down to the next generation through bloodline. However, only females can accept this mark, and the same goes for bloodline inheritance. When the mark is transferred, no matter what method is used, the original owner of the mark will lose the ability of the goddess of war." On Freya's white forehead, a silver rune shone in the darkness, like a five-toothed crown. The tip of the crown extended upwards like a spreading thorn or like a ball of flame burning fiercely. Under the light of the mark, Freya's face looked extremely holy, like a goddess, cold and noble. Brando was stunned for a moment, and the mark was reflected in his eyes, shining brightly. The goddess of war of Bucci blushed a little. She lowered her head and gently tapped the ground with the tip of her boot. Brando then realized his rudeness and quickly coughed to cover up his embarrassment. He asked again, "So, this mark should be related to your mother. Do you still have any memories of her?" Freya paused for a moment, then gently shook her head. I have never seen my mother. Actually, everything about my father was told to me by Lord Oberway and Princess Griffin. Ever since I can remember, I grew up in Bucci. My childhood memories are about the mountains of Yusong and everyone in the militia. I always thought that my parents died in the hands of the undead and it was uncle and aunt who adopted me." Brando heard something from the girl's low voice and his heart softened. He comforted her, "It's okay, Freya. But at least you still have us. All of us are with you." "Yes." "Brando," Freya hesitated for a moment before saying, "Her Highness once told me about my mother. She came to Erwin with the refugees from Silver Bay. She is half mountain folk. My father saved her and the others from a group of bandits. They fell in love at first sight and got married not long after. She's a refugee from Silver Bay. For the past few decades, the area around Silver Bay has been relatively peaceful. The only time there was unrest was during the undead disaster. That was about 30 years ago. Your mother is most likely Fano's benefactor." Brando thought for a moment before replying. Fanon was located to the northeast of Erwin. It was one of the countries along the Silver Bay, bordering the southwest of Saint Tassel. To its north was Princess Magadal's motherland, the Duchy of Antiburo. Fanon and the Maloit Peninsula occupied by the undead were separated by the sea. To the north of the peninsula was the elves' White Mountain Fortress, which was also one of the ancient battlefields between the undead and the Wind Elves. During the Year of the Cave Beasts, when the Bloodstaff wreaked havoc in the east of Karsuk, the undead fleet crossed the Silver Strait between Maloit Peninsula and Fanon and attacked the countries of Silver Bay. This was known as the Undead Disaster in history. This disaster caused thousands of people to lose their homes in Silver Bay. Fanon was the first to bear the brunt. Although this kingdom was closer to Saint Tassol, the Wind Elves were arrogant and conceited. They were unwilling to accept human refugees and sealed the country's gates during the war. Furthermore, Fanon was a kingdom under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Hence, a large number of refugees from Fanon rushed south to Erewhon. The White Mountain Range extended east into the kingdom of Fanon. The terrain of the kingdom was mountainous and half of the population were mountain people. The mountain people and the natives got along well. Hence, according to Freya's words, Brando had reason to believe that her mother's homeland was Fanon. Freya nodded. Her Royal Highness had said the same thing to her at the time. She had also gone to look up the relevant information from that time. In her mind, Brando was knowledgeable. It was within her expectations that he would be able to connect the dots. She suddenly asked, "Brando, why did you suddenly think of asking this?" "This has something to do with a thought of mine." Brando thought for a moment and decided to tell the truth. In fact, ever since he saw Andrea, he had been suspecting a possibility. The ability of the War Valkyries rather than magic was more like something he had seen in his previous life. There were also the ruins of Minas in the heart of the deadly tundra. Those huge, regular wreckage that was filled with a network of crystals made of unknown materials. He recalled the other shrines and ancient ruins he had seen in the game. Most of them had similar architectural styles. For example, Valhalla. He also remembered the scene outside the elemental barrier. The rows of unknown constructs that were suspended in the air above wound like a satellite array. Lastly, there was the metal nameplate that Magadol's grandfather gave him. There was no doubt that it was a product of technology. Although there were also empires in this world that developed magical technology like the Hazel people, magical technology was obviously different from these things. First of all, it still relied on magic and it was at a lower level. For example, the cavalry destroyers and hunters, although they were equipped with firearms, they still retained a strong ancient aura of rune golems. This was because the Hazel people's magical technology was born out of the ancient runes and golems of the wizards. Brando believed that there would never be a gap in the technology of a world. New technology would always be developed based on the existing foundation. In Wond, whether it was magic or magical technology, there was a clear line that did not exceed the productivity of this world. Even in the eyes of the players in his previous life, there would not be too many bugs. However, the technology of the mortal world and even the technology of the Buga people, compared to their relics and the products left in the relics before the last war, it was as if they had gone back thousands of years. It was as if they had returned to the era of slash and burn farming and eating raw meat. And from the various information he obtained from various sources, whether it was the Wind Empress or the Dark Dragon Odin, whether it was Minas or Ekis' daughters, whether it was the Buga people or the fairies of the elemental realm, they all told him that this world had experienced more than one great recession. In this era, the mortals were not favored by the gods. After the Fifth War, the gods left this world, or fell into eternal slumber. The mortal world was handed over to the planeswalkers of the Truth Society. The leader of the Truth Society, the Dark Dragon Odin, managed this world through the Myrna Empire. After the Sixth War, the Truth Society's Temple of the Gods, Babel Fortress, fell, and the Azure Knight and the Twilight Dragon perished together. This war had a profound impact on Wond. The Truth Society was torn apart because of the destruction of Babel Fortress, and the inheritance of ancient knowledge was lost on the earth. From this era onwards, there was a gap between modern and ancient, because the silver people who managed the knowledge, the gold people who were warriors, and the divine people who managed the knowledge also fell apart and were displaced on the earth. Before the Sixth War, although the gods were in eternal slumber, the planeswalkers still had their own inheritance. The planeswalkers from Gaia's Will, Truth Society, Gate of Arbitration, World Tree, and Earth Legion each had their own duties, and knowledge and memories were passed down from generation to generation. But after the Sixth War, the World Tree split, the Truth Society was nowhere to be found, and the Gate of Arbitration and Gaia's Will were lost. Only the Earth Legion still maintained a sound organization. In fact, it was the Myrna Empire. But even so, the superstructure of the Earth Legion, the inheritance of the planeswalkers led by the Dark Dragon, was also lost due to the fall of Babel Fortress. This could be seen from the number of planeswalkers in the Earth Legion after the Azure Knight, and even the strength of the Dark Dragon Odin himself was getting weaker with each generation. In the era of the Azure Knight, the Dark Dragon Odin could even compete with the Twilight Dragon, but in the era of the War of the Holy Saints, even the Four Sages could fight against Odin. Although Odin in that era was suspected of going easy on the Twilight Dragon, from what Brando saw and heard now, Even if the Twilight Dragon went easy on the Twilight Dragon, the four sages would not be its opponent. This could only mean that the level of power of Wand had been declining, and the reason for the decline was obviously the loss of the inheritance. This inheritance, like the civilization of the mortals of this era, also had an obvious vein to follow. It was just that it was the opposite of the progress of the mortals of this era, and it was a path that kept regressing. What about the civilization of the mortals? Going back from the era of the War of the Holy Saints to the present day, although the level of power of Wand was still declining, it was a chain reaction caused by the Golden Race and Silver Race's seclusion. During the era of the War of the Holy Saints, there were many strong people such as the 12 wizard leaders of the Silver Alliance, Medisha, Haku, the king of the Silver Elves, Harquist, Alaz, the genius of the Dragon Clan, Fuchsia, Tumen, Odin, the Witch Queen, and Kelsey. But these people were either Bugas, Silver Elves, or the descendants of the Dragon Clan, the Myrnas, or even the Divine People. Among the mortals of that era, how many people were famous? Other than the four sages who were born in response to the order, most of the heroes of the mortals were almost unknown. The only ones mentioned in history were mostly the followers of the sages, such as the Flame Family Knight, or the Wind Empress Knight. The strength of these heroes may be considered the top in this era, but it was only the top. In this era, the top powerhouses such as Vala, Mephistopheles, and the Pope of Fanzan were not inferior in terms of strength. Chapter 1350. These mortal heroes didn't count for much in that stormy era. In history, the Silver Elves' Dragon King Knights were known for their impressive military exploits. As for the human heroes, they had only won a single battle on the plains thanks to the Silver Elves' strength. That was already the most glorious military exploits of all. The reason why these people's names could survive in the world was more because of the propaganda of the holy temples and royal families of various countries, or the biased records of history. Therefore, when the Silver Elves and Bugas went into seclusion, the legends of that era, as well as the names of the powerful armies, the Dragon King Cavalry, the War Colossus, the Phoenix Guards, all disappeared from the world one by one, giving the world the illusion that the power level of Wand was declining for thousands of years. In fact, in the mortal world, since the War of the Holy Saints, both technology and magic had made great progress. The gap between the most prosperous areas of Tonajal and Cruz before Brando became the Lord was evident. The level of civilization in the border area of a small country like Erewhon was roughly equivalent to the average level of Wand 100 years ago. The gap between 100 years could be so big, not to mention that the War of the Holy Saints had been nearly 10 centuries ago. In other words, the mortal world was recovering. It inherited the 6 previous declines of Wand, and it could be said that a new country was built on the ruins of the past civilization, which was also very logical. But the problem was that, in Brando's view, there was an obvious fault between these two veins. In theory, the mortal era was brought about by the Azure Knight breaking the sky and causing the stars to fall to the earth. That was actually the 6th invasion of the Twilight recorded in the Pale Epic. In that war, Babel Fortress was destroyed by the final blow of the Twilight Dragon. After the fortress fell, the divine people fell apart, and their inheritance was lost. Only the Earth Legion survived. That was also the Dark Age when the divine people wandered the earth. In that last era, under the leadership of the Dark Dragon Odin, the last generation of the Golden Tribe, the Myrnas, established their own empire, which was also the last empire between the mortal era and the divine era. Then, at the end of the imperial era, the 4 sages were born. With the help of the Silver Folk, they overthrew the cruel rule of the Myrnas and established 4 kingdoms that truly belonged to the mortals. These 4 mortal kingdoms could be said to be built on the ruins of the Myrnas Empire, or on the ruins and relics of the past 6 eras. However, its development was 2 completely unrelated parallel lines with the civilization of the Myrnas and the divine people of the past, without any intersection. Andrea, as the goddess of war, was a member of the Earth Legion, even at the end of the Myrnas Empire, was still in the hands of the Dark Dragon Odin. But the power displayed by the war goddesses was completely different from any power system in this era that Brendel knew of. Not to mention the ancient miracles that he had seen in the ruins of the gods, such as Valhalla, and the Silver Plains that was related to the mystery of Princess Magadal. The power that it faintly displayed seemed to be out of place with the present. All signs indicated that the power and order system of the past era was a completely different power system from the power system that the mortals of this era had mastered. That kind of power and order system was more similar to what he saw outside the elemental frontier. The strange array of constructs suspended in the sky above Wand, the tens of millions of satellites, were the power system of the past era. They were the legacy of another era, and there was no fundamental difference between them. Why would such a situation occur? In this era, the power that the mortals were proficient in, the power of magic and law, and even the magical technology of the Hazel people were very crude. There were not many traces of the previous era in them. This was because the mortals used their own understanding of the chaos magic from the sea of magic, whether it was elementalists, law wizards, or other professions. Not to mention the witches who directly bypassed the power of order and law to communicate with the dark magic. These kinds of power that belonged to this era, compared to the power and law that Andrea and the other witches had mastered, or to a higher level of authority and power, such as the power of a planeswalker, were close to primitive. It was like the difference between a chisel from the Stone Age and a modern firearm. Brando himself had such power, so he could understand this point more deeply. His Mana Loss card could easily suppress all spells in this world and all spellcasters. This was the highest priority. That was why Tumen, Fuchsia, and the Stag Witch would repeatedly mention this point when they talked about the power of a planeswalker. Only a planeswalker could fight against a planeswalker. This was one of the basic principles of the world of order created by Martha. And whether it was the power of a planeswalker or the power of the goddess of war, there was no doubt that they were the legacies of the previous era. These legacies seemed to be covered by an invisible force, isolating them from this era. So that the mortals could not stand on its height, and could only struggle to find a path that belonged only to them in the wilderness of darkness and thorns. That was why the will of the Twilight Dragon, when it was outside the elemental frontier and possessed the Roman body, would contemptuously say to Eloranta, the Dragon Queen, and the others, "Your inheritance may not be the inheritance of the divine people." Brando recalled that this tendency had already been born since the first generation of the Dark Dragon of the Myrna people. There was no doubt that the Earth Legion was the inheritor of the previous era, and the Myrna Empire was the inheritor of the civilization of the previous era. Then what about the four mortal kingdoms? It should be the inheritor of the Dark Empire. In fact, whether it was Cruz, Fanzin, Eloranta, or Saint Tassol, they all inherited a lot of legacies from the Myrna Empire. The magic system of this era originated from the era of the Myrna people. Law magic, elemental magic, string magic, witchcraft, runic magic, holy words, astrology, psychic magic, and magic circle magic. The 9 factions and the classification of the mages of the factions began to appear in the middle and later stages of the Myrna dynasty. Swordsmanship, the system of Sword Saint and Extreme Sword Saint was also established by the Myrna people. Tumen also created the elemental array after the Chaos era. The 14-ring system of magic was born in the era of Urgatu, the last Dark Dragon, Odin, and the first 3 emperors. The alchemy and magic puppet technology of this era were produced in the middle and early stages of the War of the Holy Saints era. The magical technology of the Hazel people was, in fact, first proposed by Tumen. But there was no doubt that the Myrna people certainly had more than these legacies. As an empire with planeswalkers, even if the legacies of the previous era were lost in the Sixth War, it was impossible to completely disappear. Not to mention the Earth Legion. If Brando didn't know about the Earth Legion before and thought that it was just a traditional force, then when he saw the existence of Andrea and others with his own eyes, he would also understand that the Dark Dragon Odin must have held the legacies of the previous era in his hands. But why did the Kingdom of Mortals, from the Myrna Empire, only get things that were created by them? Where did the legacies of the previous era go? Brando couldn't help but think of the history of the Myrna people. The Myrna people were once the most powerful golden race. The warriors of the gods. One only needed to look at the dragons to understand how powerful the golden race was. But in the War of the Holy Saints, the level of power displayed by the Myrna people could only be regarded as slightly stronger than the Silver folk at best. It could be a powerful Silver Empire, but it was still far from being a kingdom of the Golden people. But there was no doubt that in the era of the Azure Knight, the Myrna people could definitely be regarded as the Golden Race because the Azure Knight himself was a Myrna. In other words, the level of power of the Myrna Empire, from its inception to the end of the empire, was constantly declining. But, if the kingdom of the gods and the decline of the civilization before the Sixth War was due to the repeated invasions of the Dusk, if the decline of the power level of the mortal world since the War of the Holy Saints was due to the chain reaction caused by the reclusion of the Silver folk, then why was the empire of the Min-Er people constantly declining? Although the Earth Legion had been fighting against the Chaos Legion outside the elemental barrier since the middle to late period of the Myrna people, before that the empire had been thriving with neither foreign enemies nor divisions, and had experienced a rather long period of peace. In such an era, Not only was the level of power of the empire, but even technology and civilization were regressing. This was too inconsistent with the development of things. There was only one possibility in Brando's mind that could explain this. That was the plan of the gods and Martha, the age of the mortals. Only this reason could explain why the Myrna people consciously gave up the legacy of civilization from the previous era and began to carve out a path of their own. Only this reason could explain the reclusion of the silver folk, as well as the concealment of the truth from the mortals. But all of this was just a guess in his mind for the time being. In fact, this guess had existed in his mind ever since he arrived at the elemental border. It was only after he met Andrea and the other war goddesses and confirmed the true identity of the Earth Army that it became even more deeply rooted. But this was not enough. He vaguely felt that he had grasped something, but further evidence was needed. There were too many necessary links missing in these guesses. He had a hunch that there might be another truth behind this secret, but the memories of Andrea and the others were limited. The war goddesses were actually created as combat weapons, and apart from the memories of war, they did not have much memory of their birthplace, the Silver Plains, as well as everything about the past era. But from what they said, there was another tribe that was stranded and wound for some reason, and this tribe was undoubtedly Freya's ancestors. This bloodline that had been passed down from generation to generation in the human world was obviously more likely to have memories of the past. This was why Brando was so concerned about this issue. On the one hand, it was because he hoped that Freya could solve the mystery of her own origins, but on the other hand, it was for this guess. He had a thought that this might be related to the final answer. What was the era of mortals and what did the gods and Martha want to do? Brando walked along the corridor of the courtyard while telling this thought to Freya. Of course, he left out the most bizarre and inconceivable part. This was because he could not explain to Freya what the so-called technology and the knowledge of his previous life were. He could only tell Freya that her origins might be related to the Myrnas and the secret left behind by the Darkness Dragon. Freya fell into deep thought. She thought for a moment and suddenly thought of something. I don't know much about my parents, Brendel. Everything about the past is just hearsay. Her Highness once suggested that I go to Fënorn and visit my mother's family if I have the chance. She has the bloodline of the mountain people, and most of the mountain people have long records of their own clan and history. And this, the Valkyrie said as she took off a necklace from her neck. This is something my mother left for me. Uncle and aunt gave it to me during my coming-of-age ceremony. This is something your parents left behind? Brando was shocked. This is too precious, Freya. It's nothing, Brando. Freya shook her head. I have very little memories of my parents. If it can help you find clues about my mother, it's much more meaningful than itself. Besides, there's a more important reason, isn't there? Brando took the necklace that still had a trace of the girl's body temperature and held it in his hand. It was a beautiful silver pendant with a very ordinary moonstone embedded in it. Freya looked at him holding the necklace in his hand and blushed slightly. She probably remembered where this necklace was kept close to her body. Brando inspected the necklace. The two of them did not speak for a while. The corridor was silent, and only the faint moonlight could be seen. The Valkyrie took 2 steps and suddenly slowed down. She stopped and called out softly, Brando? Brando was startled. He did not find anything suspicious about this necklace. This necklace seemed to be a very ordinary relic. It carried a mother's blessing and longing for her daughter. He heard Freya call his name from behind. Just as he was about to turn around, he suddenly felt his body tighten. A pair of arms came from behind and hugged his chest tightly. Brando immediately shut his mouth. I'll wait for you in Erewhon. Freya pressed her cheek against his back and said softly, almost trembling. Everyone will be fine, right? Brando nodded. Yes, everything will be fine. Whether it was this world or the people he wanted to protect. Chapter 1351. Battle cries came faintly from the other side of the mountain. Knights in heavy armor were climbing to the top of the mountain step by step. They looked up, and through the gaps of their metal masks, they could see the boundary between the knife-edge cliff and the sky. White mist gushed out of their mouths and intertwined in the cold air. From time to time, there were stones rolling down the mountain stream under their feet, making crashing sounds. The armor of these knights was very different from the heavy and practical armor of the Cruz people. The surface of the armor was shiny and covered with beautiful lines. Under the metal plates were thick fur for warmth. Every knight wore a long white cloak. Under the cloak, the cross and wild rose patterns on the breastplate appeared and disappeared with the knight's steps. The knights kept turning back to grab their companions. They moved forward in the steep mountain like a thin black line. Step by step, their line of sight gradually ascended until they passed the peak of the mountain. A gust of wind swept over, blowing their cloaks up. The knight walking at the front subconsciously grabbed his own cloak with a backhand grip. The earth-shattering battle cries were heard. All the sounds on the battlefield seemed to have been magnified 1,000 times in an instant. The long sound of the bugle horn and the thumping of the war drums seemed to have struck their hearts. The army was like a flood, rolling like thunder. The battlefield at Ordo's mountain pass was fully displayed in front of everyone. On the open slope, the only remaining knight of the Cruz people were attacking the black mass of the Crystal Cluster army. Layers of deep purple flashes appeared in the ocean from time to time, wave after wave, like a gale sweeping across the sea. Looking down, the entire battlefield at Ordo's mountain pass was completely intertwined. The black and red torrents separated each other. All kinds of flags fluttered in the ocean and were swallowed by waves from time to time. The colorful aristocratic coalition army was collapsing, and the heavy infantry of the Cruz people were like the mainstay of the entire battlefield, facing the repeated attacks of the Crystal Cluster army. They were like a rock standing in the middle of the raging waves. The only hope of the Cruz people was their heavy cavalry. They hoped that the heavy cavalry concentrated on the right wing could completely defeat the army in front of them before the main force of the Crystal Cluster army arrived. However, there was not much time left for them. The knight looked up. Thick clouds hung in the sky. On the land where the gloomy sky connected with the horizon of East Metz, a black ocean was spreading as far as the eye could see. He opened the metal mask, and the moonlight reflected in the depths of his eyes, sparkling. The knight turned around. The knight behind him had already raised a flag. The silver swallow-tailed flag was raised high in the strong wind. A shadow flew over everyone's heads and spread its wings. Its bony wings were more than 20 meters long. Together with the black-armored knight on its back, it swooped down into the valley. One after another, bone dragons flew out from between the steep peaks. They flew above and above the knights, and their shadows constantly streaked across the mountaintops. Should we believe them, Master Rodrigo? The knight shook his head. I've never believed in the cunning creatures of darkness, but we can't control them now. Carry out the orders of His Holiness the Pope. Blow the horn. Vahina could not remember how many times she had killed her way into the enemy's formation. Although she was a student of the Legion commander, she was not in a better state at the moment. Her body was covered in blood and almost all of it was her own. She did not know how many wounds there were under her armor. When exhaustion came, the secretion of adrenaline began to decrease. The pain came like a tidal wave and cold sweat began to seep out. The biting cold wind from the mountain pass blew, and it was bone-chilling. She had already thrown away her magic spear. It was left on the body of a medium-sized crystal cluster. She could not pull it out. The spear pierced through the monster's core and directly nailed it to the battle formation. She then switched to her own sword to fight the crystalline sparks. After killing 2 small crystalline sparks, the fine quality glimmering longsword also broke with a clang. A crystal cluster pounced on her. She roared and used all her strength to stab the broken sword into the pupil of a crystal cluster. The crystal cluster let out a sharp cry and fell back. However, after losing her sword, she was immediately faced with a desperate situation. The surging crystal clusters overturned her earth dragon. She lost her balance and fell heavily to the ground. Then the earth dragon toppled over. The young lady of the flower and leaf collar screamed and felt that her legs immediately lost feeling. Tears gushed out of her eyes uncontrollably. She knew that her leg was broken. Fortunately, the drake did not completely crush her. Otherwise, this creature, which weighed nearly 10 tons, would have killed her in an instant. But it was almost the same. Vahina looked at the crystal clusters that rushed at her in despair. Her legs were crushed under the drake's body, and she could not pull them out in a short time. Her companions were already far away, and the knight would not stop on the battlefield. Only death was left for her. Sister? She seemed to hear her sister Elise anxiously calling her name in the army. But how could that be? It was so far away and Elise could not see her in the chaos. Even if she saw her sister, how could she hear Elise's voice? The heavy knight's front line was at least a few miles away from the Buga mages. But when she heard her sister's voice, she could not stop her tears. She struggled to straighten her body and looked at the back of the battlefield in despair. It was as if she wanted to see her sister, her brother, and her father there. I'm sorry, I'm going to die. At the last moment of her life, the first thing that appeared in Vahina's mind was her mother's pale and gentle face. Then that face disappeared into the darkness, replaced by a face full of heroic spirit that was calm and composed. The razor-sharp claws tore through her armor in an instant. Vahina felt herself flying high into the air, as if everything in the world was spinning. She felt as light as a feather, as if everything was weightless. Then she felt her eyelids getting heavier and heavier. Her vision seemed to be covered by blood, and a heavy wave of fatigue swept over her. Then darkness. Cold, silent darkness. "Damn it, country bumpkin!" Veronica's face was gloomy and she grabbed Elise's arm tightly. The latter cried and called out her sister's name, but soon her voice became hoarse and she only had the strength to cry. She watched as her sister's figure was drowned by the crystal clusters. Her small body seemed to have lost all strength in an instant, and she knelt down powerlessly, kneeling on the cold sand. The female army was expressionless. As the commander of this war, she could not show the slightest sign of wavering. But Vahina's accident was like a sharp sword that pierced straight into her heart, and her lips were a little pale. At this moment, all she could do was gently help Elise up, and quietly hug the crying little girl in her arms. She did not say a word and waited for the heavy cavalry to bring the final result of this battle. Whether it was hope or despair. Elise wailed in her arms. There was not much time left. The crystal cluster army was coming from the direction of Mehodafen, and the tremors on the ground could be felt from more than 10 miles away. Small stones jumped on the ground as if they were indicating something. The light cavalry reserves of the Cruz people stood on the mound silently, and rows of knights were looking back on horseback. Between the rolling hills and the sky, there was a faint black line. The nobles' faces were ashen. Many people were looking back and the mound shook for the first time, and some people had already collapsed on the ground. Veronica hugged Elise quietly, and for the first time she did not draw her sword on the battlefield, and the knuckles of her hands were a little pale. After decades of military life, she actually felt her hands trembling, because this war was destined to bury the fate of the Cruz people. "Late King Guilt, what did we do wrong? Why are you punishing us like this?" Some people had already questioned the wind with grief and indignation. "It's over, it's all over, the empire is finished." Some people were desperate, but some people's hearts were full of heroic spirit. Little Pero looked sympathetically at Elise, who was crying so hard that she was almost exhausted. He also felt some pity for Vahina's death. She was a good girl, but he did not think that such a death was worth sighing over, because it was the rightful end of a knight. Unlike others, he witnessed the desperate and tragic battlefield in front of him, but there was not much fear in his heart. There was only boiling hot blood and full of fighting spirit. What was there to fear about death? A glorious battle, to be buried in horsehide, was the warrior's way home. Thinking of this, little Pero strode to Veronica and said loudly, "Her Excellency Legion Commander Master, order the Light Cavalry Legion to attack. We have no chance, we can only seek survival in death." He said firmly, "I am not afraid of death, but I ask for a battle." Veronica turned back and looked at him. Little Pero was the son of Sir Loston. He was once a member of the Folded Sword Knight Order, and also fought side by side with Brando and Freya during the Battle of the Deadly Frost Forest, but after that incident he stayed in Erewhon because of the eldest son of the Emperor, and his identity was also removed from the Folded Sword Knight Order. At this moment, Veronica appointed him to replace the dead Viscount Lasca as the commander of the Light Cavalry Reserve, because she valued his outstanding talent for cavalry command. And his fearless courage. "At least the Cruz people have courage," Veronica replied. Her voice was carried far away from the battlefield by the wind. The Light Cavalry Legion, which was still somewhat restless, turned solemn, and the people on horseback looked sideways, as if they had gained courage and strength from these words. Chapter 1352. The Cruz people still had courage. The Cruz people had never lacked courage. In that darkest era, who was the first to stand up, lead the mortals and raise the flag of rebellion against the Empire? It was the Cruz people. What was the path of the Golden Flame? It was an unyielding struggle, a struggle against oppression, against fate, and against life itself. The Cruz people had always looked down on the Anir people because the Fanzan people once bowed to the Myerna people and became their slaves for 400 years. Among the four empires, only the Cruz people could maintain this pride that had been passed down from generation to generation, as if it was inherited in their blood. Because the Cruz people would never bow their heads. The Light Cavalry regained their backbone just because of Veronica's words. They raised their heads, puffed out their chests and pulled out their sabers. The blades shone like snow. As if infected by the Light Cavalry, the noble coalition army on the mound, who had behaved unsightly, straightened their legs for a moment, and the crooked ranks also became orderly. The noise from the crowd quieted down. Veronica shut her mouth and no longer spoke. She was the commander of the Azure Legion, the Azure Sword Saint of the Cruise people. She had witnessed countless wars, swords, and life-and-death exchanges. She had long since become indifferent. "Teacher? Go," the female commander nodded. "Don't look back, as many as you can escape. Bring out the hope of the Empire, as long as there is still one Cruise person alive." Little Pero nodded firmly. He turned around and took 2 steps towards the mound where the Light Cavalry Legion was located. He stopped again, turned his head, and smiled brightly, revealing his snow-white teeth. Those blue eyes seemed to contain the most dazzling brilliance. The Legion moved. The Cruise people finally put their last trump card in this war, but in fact, it was all in one throw. The Crystal Legion behind them was already clearly visible, and for the Cruise people, even if they broke through the line in front of them, the long road of escape had just begun. Countless people were destined to fall on this path, and those who survived would become the hope of the Empire. The nobles mounted their horses and unsheathed their swords. In the past 1,000 years they had lost a lot of things. Courage, glory, and the responsibility of nobles. But at this moment they had to fight for themselves. They had to survive or die on the battlefield like a real knight. The female Legion commander's words seemed to have some kind of miraculous effect. No one complained and no one whispered. Everyone understood their own fate and everyone chose their own fate. Everyone gathered together. Veronica placed Elise on the horse's back and held her in her arms. She turned the horse around and drew her sword for the first time in the battle. It wasn't the azure firmament. That sword had long been lost. This sword was given to her by Brando. It was a fantasy-grade magic sword called Rose Tower. It was a gift from the Bugas to the Abes, and the young man had given it to her when he came to the Empire. He said that it was a gift to his master's wife for the sake of his teacher. Although she didn't know what a master's wife was, she could vaguely guess what it meant. She couldn't help but snort softly, thinking that this damn brat. And then there was that person. Veronica's thoughts seemed to have returned to a long time ago, to her youth, the memories of her fighting side by side with that person. Under the command of Marshal Darius, they won glorious victories one after another. Then it was a break. For the Empire, for each other's different ideals and loyalty, as if 2 separate paths were going further and further away from each other. She couldn't help but sigh softly. Then the sword in her hand was raised high. "Cruise people attack." That seemed to be a word of death. It was also the last order. However, a long horn sound suddenly resounded through the entire battlefield, drowning out all other sounds on the battlefield, drowning out the neighing of horses, the clashing of metal, and the thunderous sound of hooves. It also drowned out the order that had spread far and wide. Everyone turned their heads and looked in a certain direction on the battlefield. On the mountain peak, a silver flag shone. On the swallow-tailed flag, the white scepter and the lion's mane were as dazzling as the first light of dawn. Fanzan people. Silver Horse Cavalry Regiment. Since the First Holy War broke out in Ordos, perhaps the descendants of the Cruise people never thought that one day, the descendants of the Aenir people, Fanzan's Holy Knight, would save them from their desperate situation on the battlefield. But when did the Fanzan's Holy Knight set off from Silver Horse City and come here at this moment to save the Empire? Perhaps 1,300 years ago, when the Cruise people saw the Wind Elf Giant Eagle Knight appear from the horizon on the Great Plains, they had the same feeling. Only at this moment, the nobles of the Cruise people finally remembered that an era ago, they were once allies who fought side by side. Although there were hundreds or even hundreds of years of hatred and misunderstanding, although there were several or even dozens of generations of conspiracies and conflicts, when the descendants of the Cruise people fell into a desperate situation, the descendants of the Aenir people still came. A roar came from the top of the mountain. "Cruise people, do you still remember the sacred oath?" This roar, through the power of magic, spread throughout the battlefield. Countless Cruise people had tears in their eyes at this moment in front of their former enemy. The knight raised the spears in their hands, pointed high to the sky, and rushed to the battlefield with their left hands on their chests. "Let the heavens bear witness, let Martha bear witness." The oath was still in effect. A shadow first fell on the battlefield. The Cruise people thought that they could see the Silver Horse Knight flying in the sky, but they found that they were wrong because they saw dragons. To be exact, they were humorous dragons. Countless humorous dragons swept in from both sides of the valley like pale sickles. There were so many of them that they covered the entire battlefield in an instant. What the hell is this? Everyone was stunned. Before they could react, the most powerful undead creatures in the world had flown over the battlefield one by one, and hundreds of frost breaths swept across the Crystal Legion army. In an instant, the Crystal Legion army blocking in front of the Ordos mountain pass was in chaos. The humorous dragons didn't stop but continued to fly forward. Behind the crew's people, a dense shadow suddenly appeared in the sky. Countless Crystal Legions were descending from the clouds. The main force of the Crystal Legion army had arrived. Countless humorous dragons formed a standard arrow formation and collided head-on without stopping. Veronica didn't have time to be surprised when she saw this. She knew that the only chance on the battlefield had appeared. Her legs squeezed the belly of her horse tightly, and she immediately rushed to the battlefield with her horse. Kurlutzians. She took the lead and shouted, "Charge! Kill!" The knights seemed to have woken up from a dream. They immediately shouted in unison and swept toward the front of the battlefield. The light cavalry legion rolled down like an avalanche, and in an instant the situation of the entire battlefield was affected. The morale of the aristocratic alliance army was high, and they turned into a torrent and followed closely behind. The Crystal Legion army at the front of the battlefield immediately began to adjust their formation. It was as if there was an invisible and powerful will controlling them, causing these dull creatures to rush forward without fear of death. They wanted to drag the crew's people here. At this moment, both sides understood. Life and death would be decided in this instant. But it was at this moment. A bright sword light suddenly appeared on the battlefield. The sword light was like the rising sun. It rose slowly in the dark night and exploded in an instant. In just an instant it was thousands of meters long and wide. With a slanted sword, the entire battlefield was cut open. The bright sword light was as fast as a bolt of lightning, but in everyone's eyes, it was so slow that it seemed like time was flowing on the blade. It lightly swept across the battlefield and landed in the midst of the Crystal Cluster army that was charging at them. Even the Buga Silver Robe Wizard Regiment, Holy See Vala, the Saintess of the Leo Holy Palace, Luoan, and the others who were guiding the spell to bless the entire legion couldn't help but raise their heads and look in this direction. When the 37 Flame family knight left on the battlefield saw this sword light, they couldn't help but tremble. The peak of the Supreme Realm, one step away from the sage. This sword light. It cut open the Crystal Legion army from the middle. Thousands of Crystal Legions turned into flying ashes under this sword light. A passage of hundreds of meters wide was cut open between the Crystal Legion army. Under the moonlight, a man and a sword slowly passed through this passage as if there was no one around, and came to the front of crew's people. When Veronica saw that man, she was already shocked. Mephisto, Ash Sword Saint? Mephisto stood alone on the battlefield. He sheathed his sword with one hand and carried the giant sword on his back again. On both sides of him, before the Crystal Legion army could rush forward again, they were already surged by Cruz's heavy knight. The torrent of heavy knights separated from both sides of him, and this sword saint seemed to be going against the current in the turbulence. He walked step by step to Veronica. Only then did the commander see clearly that there was another person beside Mephisto. Mephistopheles? She was stunned and quickly tightened the reins. However, Elise, who was in her arms, suddenly exclaimed, "Sister!" The vampire youth held the injured and unconscious knight's daughter in his arms. He tilted his head and smiled cutely, revealing his small white fangs. "Mistress is a little injured, but fortunately, it shouldn't be a big problem." "Mistress?" Elise was surprised. For a moment, she even jumped off the horse to care about her sister's injury and stopped on the horse's back. "Very good." Rodrigue then withdrew his gaze from the battlefield and nodded. "The Kurlutz people are at least decent. Compared to those nobles in the country who can't help up the wall, I'd rather deal with real warriors, even if they used to be enemies." The knights laughed loudly. Silver Pegasi were flapping their wings and landing on the top of the mountain. The knights took off their cloaks one by one and threw them aside. Then they mounted their horses and pulled out their swords. "Now it's our turn." Order of the Silver Horse, attack. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.